Some places remember what happened to them, and some places refuse to let you forget. Custer Ridge rises from the Montana grasslands like a spine of ancient memory. It is not a dramatic formation, merely a gradual swell of earth that crests at 4,200 feet above sea level, overlooking the valley where the Little Bighorn River bends westward toward the Crow Reservation. The ridge is part of Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument, a 765-acre expanse of rolling prairie that draws roughly 300,000 visitors each year. Most come to see the white marble headstones that dot the hillside, marking where soldiers of the 7th Cavalry fell on June 25, 1876. Most leave with photographs, pamphlets, and a vague sense of historical gravity. But some visitors leave with something else, a feeling they struggle to articulate, a memory of a moment when the world around them went suddenly, impossibly quiet. The phenomenon centers on a specific section of Custer Ridge, a 50-yard stretch running northeast from Marker 47 toward the cluster of stones near Last Stand Hill. The terrain here is unremarkable. Short grass prairie, scattered sagebrush, a few lichen-covered rocks. The soil is clay-heavy, typical of southeastern Montana. There is nothing in the topography to suggest acoustic anomaly, no canyon walls to absorb sound, no dense vegetation to muffle footsteps. The ridge is open, exposed, and by every measurable standard, ordinary. And yet, the first documented account of the silence came in 1952 from a seasonal ranger named Howard Macklin. Macklin had worked at the battlefield for 3 summers and knew the terrain intimately. In a handwritten incident report dated August 14th of that year, he described leading a group of 12 visitors along the interpretive trail when he noticed something peculiar. His own voice, he wrote, seemed to fall dead at a certain point on the ridge. He could feel his vocal cords vibrating, could sense the breath leaving his lungs, but the sound that reached his ears was thin and distant, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. The visitors noticed it too. Several stopped walking. One woman, a schoolteacher from Billings, named Dorothy Halverson, reportedly pressed her hands over her ears and asked if anyone else heard the pressure. Macklin's report was filed with the National Park Service Regional Office in Billings. It was never followed up on. No investigation was conducted. The document remained in a filing cabinet for 35 years, until a graduate student named Rebecca Thornton discovered it while researching ranger folklore for her thesis at the University of Montana. Thornton's discovery in 1987 coincided with a broader interest in acoustic anomalies at national parks. That same year, the Park Service quietly commissioned a study of environmental sound irregularities at several western monuments, including Little Bighorn. The study was led by Dr. Franklin Yates, an acoustic engineer from Colorado State University, who had previously consulted on noise pollution issues at Yellowstone and Grand Teton. Yates arrived at Little Bighorn in late September of 1987 with a team of 3 graduate assistants and roughly $15,000 worth of recording equipment. Over the course of 11 days, they conducted systematic sound measurements across the battlefield, focusing on ambient noise levels, echo response times, and frequency absorption rates. The methodology was straightforward, the kind of fieldwork Yates had done dozens of times before. The trouble began on day 4. According to field notes later obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, Yates and his team positioned their equipment along Custer Ridge at 9:15 in the morning on September 23rd. The weather was clear, wind speed under 5 miles per hour, ideal conditions for acoustic measurement. They set up 3 omnidirectional microphones at intervals of 20 yards and began recording ambient sound while one team member, a master's student named Luis Obregon, walked the ridge speaking predetermined test phrases at calibrated volumes. The first 2 microphones captured Obregon's voice normally. The third, positioned near Marker 47, recorded only static. Yates assumed equipment malfunction. They replaced the microphone, checked the cables, tested the recorder with a handheld tone generator. Everything functioned correctly. But when Obregon walked the ridge again, The same thing happened. His voice, clearly audible to the naked ear from 20 yards away, failed to register on the recording at that specific location. The waveform showed only a flat line interrupted by occasional bursts of white noise. Over the next 7 days, the team documented what Yates would later call, in private correspondence, a localized acoustic dead zone approximately 53 yards in length and 11 yards in width. Within this zone, sound behaved in ways that defied standard physics. Human voices dropped in perceived volume by an estimated 15 to 20 decibels. Footsteps on dry grass became inaudible. A handclap that should have produced a sharp report instead made a muffled thump, as if performed underwater. Recording equipment consistently failed to capture sounds generated within the zone, though it functioned normally everywhere else on the battlefield. Yates interviewed 7 park employees during his time at Little Bighorn. All 7 confirmed experiencing the phenomenon at some point during their tenure. A maintenance worker named Gerald Whitehorse, who had grown up on the Crow Reservation and worked at the monument for 19 years, told Yates that he avoided that section of the ridge entirely. When pressed for explanation, Whitehorse reportedly said only that some ground holds on to what it heard. The team also collected accounts from 3 visitors who happened to be at the battlefield during the study. A retired postal worker from Minnesota named Earl Lindquist described the sensation as like someone turned down the volume on the world. His wife, Marjorie, said she felt a sudden pressure in her ears, similar to the sensation of rapid altitude change, though the ridge's elevation varies by less than 40 feet across its entire length. Perhaps the most unsettling account came from Yates's own assistant, Obregon, who spent more time in the zone than anyone else during the study. In a memo to Yates, dated October 1st, 1987, 8 days after the fieldwork concluded, Obregon wrote that he had begun experiencing residual auditory effects since returning to Colorado. Sounds seemed slightly muted to him now, he explained. Conversations required more effort to follow. A hearing test administered by the University Health Center showed no abnormality, but Obregon remained convinced that something had changed. It's like part of the silence came back with me, he wrote. I don't know how else to describe it. Yates compiled his findings into a preliminary report submitted to the Park Service in November of 1987. The report was 47 pages long and included spectrographic analysis, topographical maps, and a detailed literature review of known acoustic phenomena. It concluded that the Custer Ridge anomaly could not be explained by any documented geological, atmospheric, or electromagnetic mechanism. Yates recommended further study, including ground-penetrating radar surveys and collaboration with specialists in infrasound and environmental acoustics. The report was never published. In December of 1987, the Park Service responded to Yates with a brief letter thanking him for his work and stating that budgetary constraints prevented further investigation at that time. The letter also requested that Yates refrain from discussing his findings publicly until the service had completed its own internal review. No such review was ever conducted, or at least none that produced any publicly available documentation. 3 weeks after receiving the letter, Yates submitted a request to transfer from his position at Colorado State to a private consulting firm in Phoenix. His application cited personal reasons and a desire to pursue opportunities outside academic research. Colleagues who knew him at the time later described the decision as sudden and uncharacteristic. Yates had tenure, a well-funded lab, and no obvious reason to leave. He never spoke about the Little Bighorn study again. He died in 2014 at the age of 71. His personal papers, donated to Colorado State's archive, contain no mention of the project. The acoustic dead zone remains on Custer Ridge. It has never been officially acknowledged in park literature, signage, or visitor information. Rangers who work at Little Bighorn today are aware of it. Several have described it in online forums and informal interviews, but none have been authorized to comment on the record. The Park Service's official position, when asked, is that no anomaly exists, And yet the reports continue. A travel blogger in 2019 described losing the sound of her own breathing while standing near marker 47. A retired acoustician who visited in 2021 measured a 14 decibel drop in ambient sound within the zone. Using a smartphone app, a crude instrument, but consistent with Yates's findings from 34 years earlier. Some visitors don't notice anything at all. They walk the ridge, read the markers, take their photographs, and leave. But others pause at that spot on the trail. They tilt their heads slightly, as if listening for something. Their companions speak to them, and they don't respond right away. For just a moment, they are somewhere else, somewhere the sound of the present cannot reach. The Crow people have a phrase for places like this. Roughly translated, it means where the earth holds its breath. They do not explain what the earth is waiting for. Every photograph tells you what was there, but sometimes a photograph tells you what shouldn't have been. The Deep Ravine Trail winds through the southeastern section of Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument, descending from the main visitor area toward a narrow depression where some of the battle's final moments unfolded. The ravine itself is unremarkable, a shallow cut in the prairie, perhaps 30 feet deep at its lowest point, choked with wild grass and sagebrush. Historians believe that between 28 and 40 soldiers retreated here during the chaos of June 25, 1876, seeking cover that the open ridge could not provide. They were overtaken within minutes. Archaeological surveys conducted in 1984 recovered bone fragments, buttons, and spent cartridge casings scattered across the ravine floor. The marble headstones that mark individual fall sites were placed throughout the battlefield, beginning in 1890, part of a congressional effort to honor the 7th Cavalry dead. Most markers bear no names. The bodies had decomposed beyond identification by the time the memorialization effort began. They stand as anonymous monuments, white against the brown grass, each one representing a man whose final moments played out on this ground nearly 150 years ago. Marker 128 stood approximately 200 yards from the main trail, positioned on a slight rise overlooking the mouth of the ravine. It was indistinguishable from the other 300 or so markers on the battlefield. A simple marble slab, weathered by Montana winters, bearing only a small carved cross and the words U.S. Soldier, 7th Cavalry. For decades, it attracted no particular attention. Then, in 1952, a tourist from Pennsylvania named Harold Messner took a photograph that would quietly reshape what we think we know about the battlefield. Messner was a 43-year-old insurance adjuster from Allentown, traveling west with his wife and 2 children. They stopped at Little Bighorn on August 7th, part of a 3-week road trip to Yellowstone. Messner carried a Kodak Brownie Hawkeye, a popular consumer camera of the era, and took several photographs throughout the monument. One of these showed his wife, Evelyn, standing beside marker 128, smiling slightly against the afternoon sun. When the Messners returned home and had their film developed at a local pharmacy, they noticed something unusual in the photograph. Standing approximately 8 feet behind Evelyn, partially obscured by the angle of the shot, was the figure of a man. He was facing away from the camera, toward the ravine, wearing what appeared to be a dark military jacket with brass buttons. His posture was rigid, his arms at his sides. His head was bare. Evelyn Messner had been alone when the photograph was taken. Harold was certain of this. He had framed the shot himself, checking the viewfinder before pressing the shutter. There had been no other visitors in that section of the battlefield. The Messners did not report the anomaly. They assumed it was a double exposure, a defect in the film, or perhaps a trick of light and shadow. The photograph was placed in an album and largely forgotten. It resurfaced in 1978 when Harold Messner's daughter, Patricia Messner Kowalski, donated a collection of family photographs to the Allentown Historical Society. An archivist reviewing the collection noticed the figure in the Little Bighorn image and flagged it for further examination. By then, The society had received 3 other photographs from different donors, all taken at marker 128, all showing similar anomalies. The second photograph dated to 1961, taken by a school teacher from Omaha named Virginia Tollefson. The third was from 1967, captured by a retired Marine named Douglas Yamamoto during a cross-country motorcycle trip. The fourth came from 1974, submitted by a Canadian couple, Bernard and Simone Lacroix, who had visited the battlefield while honoring Bernard's grandfather, a veteran of the First World War. In each image, the same detail appeared: a solitary figure standing behind the primary subject, facing away, dressed in what multiple analysts would later describe as consistent with 1870s U.S. cavalry uniforms. The figure's height, posture, and positioning varied slightly between photographs, but the overall impression was identical. He was always alone. He was always looking toward the ravine. And in none of the photographs did his face appear. Word of the anomaly spread slowly through academic and collector circles. By 1983, the Allentown Historical Society had identified 11 photographs taken at marker 128 between 1952 and 1981, all exhibiting the same phenomenon. The photographers had no connection to one another. They used different cameras, different film stocks, and visited in different seasons and years. None reported seeing another person near the marker at the time of exposure. A photographic analyst named Dr. Miriam Okonkwo, then teaching at Temple University, examined 7 of the images in 1984 at the Society's request. Her report, never formally published but preserved in the Society's archives, concluded that the photographs showed no evidence of double exposure, manipulation, or mechanical defect. The figure, she wrote, appeared to be physically present in the frame at the moment of capture. I cannot explain what I am seeing, Okonkwo wrote in her summary, but I can confirm that it is not a photographic artifact. Whatever this is, the camera recorded it as a 3-dimensional object occupying real space. Okonkwo attempted to contact the National Park Service to request access to the battlefield for further study. Her letters went unanswered. A follow-up phone call in March of 1985 was transferred 3 times before a representative informed her that the Park Service had no comment on alleged paranormal activity and that research requests required departmental approval, which could take up to 18 months. She never received approval. In 1989, the Park Service announced that marker 128 would be temporarily removed for restoration and preservation. A work order dated April 12th of that year authorized the marker's extraction, transport to an off-site facility in Billings for cleaning and stabilization. The work order estimated a restoration period of 6 to 8 months. The marker was never returned. Requests submitted under the Freedom of Information Act in 1993, 2001, and 2016 yielded partial documentation. The 1993 request produced a single-page memo indicating that marker 128 had been placed in long-term storage pending further review. The 2001 request was denied, entirely on grounds of administrative sensitivity. The 2016 request produced a heavily redacted inventory list showing the marker's transfer to an unnamed federal storage facility in Wyoming. No explanation was given for why a routine restoration project required 27 years and counting. Park rangers, who worked at Little Bighorn during the 1980s, have offered conflicting accounts. A former seasonal employee named Curtis Belanger, interviewed in 2009 for a regional history podcast, recalled that staff were informally discouraged from answering visitor questions about marker 128. We were told it was a liability issue, Belanger said. Something about not wanting to encourage people to wander off trail. But nobody ever explained what the actual liability was. Another former ranger, who agreed to speak only on condition of anonymity, described finding a visitor standing motionless near the marker's former location in 1992, 3 years after its removal. The visitor, a middle-aged woman traveling alone, claimed she had been following someone who walked down from the main trail and stopped at that exact spot. When the ranger asked who she had been following, the woman could not describe the person's face, only his clothing, a dark jacket with brass buttons. The photographs continue to surface. In 2007, a digital image taken by a tourist from South Korea showed what appeared to be a figure standing at the site where marker 128 once stood, though no marker remained. In 2019, a wildlife photographer reviewing drone footage of the Deep Ravine Trail noticed a shadow near the site that did not correspond to any visible object. Neither image has been formally analyzed. The Park Service has not responded to inquiries about them. Marker 128 no longer exists on any official battlefield map. Its location is not mentioned in visitor guides or interpretive materials. The ground where it stood is indistinguishable from the surrounding prairie, just grass and wind, and the long slope down to the ravine. But visitors still stop there. Not often, not in large numbers, just occasionally. Someone will pause on the trail, look toward that unremarkable patch of earth, and raise their camera. They take a photograph. And sometimes, when they look at it later, they find that they were not alone. There are places where time moves differently, and there are places where time refuses to be recorded at all. Reno Hill rises approximately 3 miles southeast of Last Stand Hill, separated from the main battlefield by a series of shallow coulees and the winding path of the Little Bighorn River. It is not a dramatic elevation, perhaps 80 feet above the surrounding floodplain, but its strategic significance in the Battle of June 25, 1876, cannot be overstated. This is where Major Marcus Reno and roughly 130 surviving soldiers of the 7th Cavalry established a defensive perimeter after their disastrous retreat from the valley floor. They held this position for nearly 24 hours, enduring repeated attacks, dwindling ammunition, and the distant sounds of what they did not yet know was Custer's annihilation 3 miles to the north. The terrain of Reno Hill is sparse and exposed. Short grass prairie gives way to patches of sagebrush and occasional clusters of yucca. The soil is thin, underlaid by compressed clay that turns slick after rain and cracks into geometric patterns during dry spells. From the hilltop, the view extends for miles in every direction, a landscape that has changed remarkably little since 1876. The same ridgelines, the same river bends, the same silence that settles over the Montana plains when the wind dies down. Historians have walked this ground for over a century. They have mapped it, photographed it, and written extensively about the movements of soldiers across its surface. The retreat from the valley to Reno Hill is one of the most studied episodes of the battle, a chaotic, desperate flight that covered roughly half a mile of terrain in what contemporary accounts estimate was between 12 and 18 minutes. In 1983, a team from the Western Military History Consortium decided to test those estimates. The project was led by Dr. Warren Kirkpatrick, a professor of military history at the University of Wyoming, and included 3 graduate students and 2 independent researchers specializing in cavalry tactics. Their methodology was straightforward: walk the retreat route at varying speeds while recording elapsed time with multiple devices. Then compare the results against historical accounts and archaeological evidence. The goal was to establish a more precise timeline of Reno's retreat and identify any discrepancies in the existing scholarship. The team arrived at Little Bighorn on September 14, 1983. They spent 2 days surveying the terrain and establishing waypoints based on known positions of fallen soldiers and documented landmarks. On September 16th, they began their timed walks. The first anomaly appeared during the 3rd trial. According to field notes later obtained by researcher Deborah Faulkner, who wrote extensively about the incident in an unpublished manuscript, the team completed their 3rd walk at approximately 2:15 in the afternoon. The route began at the valley floor near the present-day Reno crossing marker and ended at the hilltop defensive position, a distance of roughly half a mile. Dr. Kirkpatrick carried a mechanical stopwatch. Graduate student Thomas Oyeleran wore a digital wristwatch. A third team member, independent researcher Nancy Villarreal, operated a handheld audio recorder with a timestamp function. When the team compared their recordings at the end of the walk, they discovered a discrepancy. Kirkpatrick's stopwatch showed an elapsed time of 14 minutes and 22 seconds. O'Yeleran's digital watch showed 14 minutes and 15 seconds, a difference easily attributable to slight variations in start and stop timing. But Villarreal's audio recorder showed only 7 minutes and 18 seconds of captured sound. The remaining 7 minutes were simply absent. The recording jumped from a mid-sentence observation about soil composition to a comment about reaching the hilltop, with nothing in between. Villarreal assumed the recorder had malfunctioned. She checked the batteries, rewound the tape, and played it back twice more. The gap remained. She had been speaking continuously throughout the walk. Her voice was audible before and after the gap, but for 7 minutes, the tape held only silence. Not static, not background noise. Absolute silence, as if the recording had been paused and resumed without any indication on the device. The team repeated the walk 4 more times over the following 2 days. Each time, they used different combinations of recording equipment: film cameras, additional audio recorders, a second digital watch, and a mechanical chronograph borrowed from the university's physics department. Each time, the same 7-minute gap appeared in at least one device's recording, always corresponding to the same stretch of terrain, a 200-yard section beginning approximately 150 yards from the river and ending at the base of the hill's final ascent. The gaps were not consistent across all devices simultaneously. During one walk, the film camera recorded normally, while both audio recorders showed gaps. During another, the chronograph stopped entirely for 7 minutes before resuming without any apparent mechanical cause. The digital watches, which should have been immune to external interference, occasionally displayed impossible readings, jumping backward by several seconds, or showing elapsed times that exceeded the actual duration of the walk. Dr. Kirkpatrick documented these anomalies in meticulous detail. His field notes, totaling 47 pages, describe each trial with clinical precision, but his personal correspondence, preserved in the University of Wyoming's archive, reveals a deeper unease. "I have no explanation for what we observed," he wrote to a colleague on September 20th, 1983. "The equipment was sound, the methodology was sound, and yet time itself appears to behave differently on that section of the hill. I do not know what to make of this, and I am not certain I want to." The consortium's final report, submitted in December of 1983, made no mention of the temporal anomalies. It focused exclusively on the physical logistics of Reno's retreat and concluded that the historical estimates of 12 to 18 minutes were likely accurate. The 7-minute gaps were omitted entirely. When Faulkner interviewed Kirkpatrick in 1997 for her manuscript, he acknowledged the omission but declined to explain it. "Some findings," he said, "do not belong in academic literature, not because they are false, but because they cannot be contextualized. We had data that contradicted itself. Publishing it would have accomplished nothing except damaging our credibility." Kirkpatrick died in 2004. His field notes were donated to the university archive, with a restriction preventing their reproduction or quotation without family permission. That permission has been denied to every researcher who has requested it. But the phenomenon did not end with the 1983 study. In 1991, a documentary film crew from a cable history channel experienced similar anomalies while shooting reenactment footage on Reno Hill. Their production logs indicate approximately 11 minutes of unusable footage frames that appeared overexposed or entirely blank, all captured within the same 200-yard zone identified by Kirkpatrick's team. The documentary aired in 1992 without any mention of the lost footage. In 2008, a team of graduate students from Montana State University attempted to replicate Kirkpatrick's study using modern digital equipment. Their results, summarized in an internal departmental memo obtained through a public records request, described persistent synchronization failures in GPS time-stamped data and audio recordings within a localized area consistent with historical accounts. The memo recommended further study. No further study was funded. The most recent known replication occurred in 2017, conducted by an independent researcher named Samuel Okonkwo, no relation to the photographic analyst who studied the Marker 128 photographs. Okonkwo used smartphone applications to record time, location, and audio while walking the retreat route. His recordings showed a gap of 6 minutes and 53 seconds, nearly identical to the 7-minute gaps documented 34 years earlier. Okonkwo posted his findings on an online forum dedicated to battlefield anomalies. Within 48 hours, his account was suspended for violating community guidelines. He has not spoken publicly about the incident since. The National Park Service has never acknowledged the temporal anomalies at Reno Hill. Ranger training materials make no reference to them. Visitor guides describe the retreat route in purely historical terms, noting the courage of the soldiers who held the position and the strategic decisions that shaped their survival. The 200-yard zone is not marked, fenced, or distinguished in any way from the surrounding terrain. Visitors walk through it every day. Most notice nothing unusual. They check their watches, take their photographs, and continue to the hilltop overlook. But some visitors report a strange sensation as they pass through that section of the trail. A feeling of compression, as if the air itself has grown heavier. A momentary disorientation, like waking from a dream they cannot remember. A few have described checking their phones afterward and finding the time slightly different than expected, a minute or two ahead or behind, with no explanation. They dismiss it as distraction, the mind wandering, the heat of a Montana afternoon. But the recordings tell a different story. 7 minutes that refuse to be captured. 7 minutes that exist in memory but not on tape. 7 minutes that happened, by every subjective account, but leave no trace. On June 25, 1876, Major Reno's surviving soldiers reached the hilltop and began digging rifle pits with knives and mess kits. They did not know what had happened to Custer. They did not know if relief would come. They knew only that they had crossed that ground through chaos and gunfire and somehow arrived alive. They never wrote about how long the retreat felt. They never described the passage of time during those desperate minutes. Perhaps they knew what the researchers would later discover. Some distances cannot be measured, and some minutes do not belong to the living. The earth remembers what stood upon it. Sometimes, the earth shows you. Last Stand Hill is the most visited site within Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument. It rises gently from the surrounding prairie, crowned by a granite obelisk erected in 1881 to honor the soldiers of the 7th Cavalry who fell on June 25, 1876. The hill offers an unobstructed view of the Little Bighorn River Valley to the west and the rolling grasslands that extend toward the Wolf Mountains in the east. On clear days, visitors can see for 30 miles in every direction. The landscape feels infinite, timeless, indifferent to the violence that once swept across it. The vegetation on Last Stand Hill is typical of southeastern Montana's shortgrass prairie. Blue grama and buffalo grass dominate, interspersed with western wheatgrass and needle and thread. The growing season begins in late April, when snowmelt saturates the clay-heavy soil, and peaks in late May or early June, before the summer heat turns the hillside to a uniform brown. Park maintenance crews mow designated areas near the walking paths, but most of the hill remains in its natural state, a patchwork of green and gold that shifts with the seasons. From ground level, the grass looks unremarkable, but from the air, something else becomes visible. The first known aerial photograph of Last Stand Hill was taken on May 12, 1948, by a U.S. Geological Survey pilot named Raymond Hostetter. Hostetter was conducting routine mapping flights over the Crow Indian Reservation when he passed over the battlefield and snapped several images for reference. The photographs were archived with the USGS regional office in Denver and largely forgotten. In 1971, a graduate student named Eleanor Winslow retrieved the images while researching historical land use patterns in Montana. Among the routine survey shots, she noticed something peculiar in frame 17, a distinct rectangular shape on the eastern slope of Last Stand Hill, darker than the surrounding grass, measuring approximately 40 by 60 feet. Winslow initially assumed the shape was an artifact of shadow or uneven terrain. But when she examined subsequent aerial surveys from 1953, 1959, and 1964, the same rectangle appeared in each May photograph, in the same location, with the same dimensions. The shape was absent in images taken during July and August, when the grass had dried to its summer dormancy. It appeared only during the spring growing season. Winslow brought her findings to the attention of her advisor, Dr. Harold Magnuson at the University of Montana. Magnuson was skeptical but intrigued. He contacted the National Park Service and requested permission to conduct soil sampling at the site. His request was approved in March of 1972. The field study took place over 3 days in late May. Magnuson and Winslow collected 17 soil samples from within the rectangular zone and 15 control samples from adjacent areas. They measured chlorophyll density in grass blades, tested soil pH levels, analyzed nitrogen and phosphorus content, and used ground-penetrating radar to scan for buried objects or structural remnants. The results were unremarkable. Every measurement fell within normal parameters. The soil inside the rectangle was chemically identical to the soil outside it. The radar scans showed no subsurface anomalies, no bones, no metal, no evidence of disturbance. The grass inside the rectangle was the same species as the grass outside. There was no physical reason for it to grow differently, and yet it did. Winslow documented the visual difference in her field notes. The grass within the rectangle was approximately 2 inches taller than the surrounding vegetation and displayed a noticeably deeper green coloration. The boundaries of the shape were remarkably precise, not the gradual fading one might expect from variations in soil moisture or sunlight exposure, but sharp edges, as if the grass had been planted in a deliberate pattern. The rectangle's dimensions corresponded almost exactly to the standard formation of a U.S. cavalry company in 1876, 40 feet wide, 60 feet deep, with soldiers arranged in 4 ranks of roughly 25 men each. Magnuson did not include this observation in his final report. When Winslow asked why, he reportedly told her that correlation was not causation, and that suggesting a supernatural connection would undermine the scientific credibility of their work. The report, submitted to the Park Service in August of 1972, concluded only that localized vegetation density variations were observed, but could not be attributed to any measurable environmental factor. The Park Service filed the report and took no further action. But the rectangle continued to appear. In 1979, a Billings Gazette photographer named Marcus Anaya chartered a small plane to capture aerial images of the battlefield for a centennial retrospective. His photographs, published in the June 24th edition, clearly showed the rectangular pattern on Last Stand Hill. Several readers wrote letters to the editor asking about the shape. The newspaper did not respond, and Anaya later said he was advised by his editor to avoid discussing it. In 1985, a documentary crew from Japanese public television filmed the battlefield from a helicopter as part of a series on American historical sites. Their footage, preserved in the network's archive, shows the rectangle in sharp detail during a slow pan across Last Stand Hill. The segment was cut from the final broadcast without explanation. By the early 1990s, the phenomenon had attracted attention from a small community of independent researchers. A retired cartographer named Ingrid Solberg compiled a collection of 43 aerial photographs spanning 1948 to 1992, all showing the same rectangular pattern during spring months. She submitted her findings to the Journal of American History in 1994. The submission was rejected without peer review. A letter from the editorial board stated that the topic fell outside the scope of conventional historical inquiry. Solberg published her research independently in 1997 through a small press in Bozeman. The book, titled Patterns in the Prairie, sold fewer than 800 copies. She died in 2011 without ever receiving academic recognition for her work. The Park Service has never officially acknowledged the rectangle. It does not appear in interpretive materials, visitor guides, or educational programming. Rangers who have worked at Little Bighorn describe being instructed not to discuss vegetation anomalies with visitors. A maintenance supervisor who served at the monument from 1988 to 2003, speaking on condition of anonymity, confirmed that staff were aware of the pattern, but had been told it was a natural occurrence, not worth mentioning. Soil testing has been conducted at least twice since Magnuson's original study, once in 1998 by a team from Colorado State University, and again in 2014 by researchers affiliated with the Smithsonian Institution. Neither study has been published. Freedom of Information Act requests for the 2014 data yielded only a single-page summary stating that no actionable findings had resulted from the investigation. The rectangle remains. It appears each spring, typically between late April and mid-June. Drone footage captured by visitors in recent years has circulated on social media, drawing modest attention from paranormal enthusiasts and amateur historians. The Park Service has responded to none of these posts. Those who have seen the pattern from the air describe it consistently. A darker green rectangle on the eastern slope, sharp edges, perfect proportions. Grass that grows taller, thicker, and greener than anything around it, as if the soil beneath it holds something the rest of the hill does not. There are many theories. Some suggest that the intensive activity on this exact spot during the battle, the concentration of bodies, horses, blood, and gunpowder, left a chemical residue too subtle for modern instruments to detect. Others propose that the collective trauma of the event somehow imprinted itself on the land in ways science cannot yet measure. A few, speaking more quietly, suggest that the grass is not remembering something from the past. It is marking something that never left. The Crow people, whose reservation surrounds the battlefield, have their own interpretation. An elder named Thomas 3 Irons, interviewed for a 2009 oral history project, said his grandmother warned him about Last Stand Hill when he was a boy. She said the soldiers are still standing there, he recalled. They never moved. They're still in formation, waiting for orders that won't come. And the grass grows around them, because the earth knows they're there, even if we can't see them. 3 Irons paused during the interview. She told me not to walk through that spot in springtime, he said. She said you might step on someone who doesn't know he's dead. Every May, the rectangle appears. Every July, it fades. The dimensions never change. The location never shifts. The grass grows in formation, and no one can explain why the earth keeps showing us what should no longer be there. Some journeys have no destination. Some travelers have already arrived. Medicine Tail Coulee cuts through the heart of Little Bighorn battlefield like a scar in the prairie. The shallow ravine descends from the eastern ridgeline toward the Little Bighorn River, its walls rising perhaps 20 feet on either side before flattening into the grassy floodplain. Historians believe this is where Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer attempted to cross the river on June 25, 1876, a flanking maneuver that would have allowed his battalion to strike the massive Lakota and Cheyenne encampment from an unexpected angle. He never made it across. The ford at the base of the coulee is unremarkable now. The river runs shallow here, rarely more than knee-deep, even during spring snowmelt. Cottonwood trees line the banks, their roots clutching the soft earth, where the water has carved away the soil over centuries. In summer, the crossing is peaceful dragonflies hovering over the current, meadowlarks calling from the tall grass. Nothing in the landscape suggests violence or urgency. The coulee is accessible via a gravel road that branches from the main battlefield tour route. Fewer visitors make the drive than those who stay near Last Stand Hill, but those who do often describe a particular quality to the silence here, a stillness that feels deliberate, as if the land itself is holding something back. The Crow and Northern Cheyenne peoples, whose reservations border the battlefield, have long considered Medicine Tail Coulee a place of significance. Oral traditions describe it as a threshold, a point where one world meets another. Elders have cautioned against lingering at the ford after sunset. They do not always explain why. The first documented sighting occurred on August 14, 1971. A family from suburban Chicago, Gerald and Patricia Novotny, and their 2 teenage children had spent the morning touring the battlefield before driving down to the Medicine Tail Ford. Patricia later described the encounter in a letter to the Park Service, a copy of which remains in the monument's administrative files. According to her account, the family had just parked near the interpretive sign when Patricia noticed an elderly woman walking along the riverbank approximately 50 yards ahead. The woman appeared to be Native American, with long gray hair worn in 2 braids. She was dressed in what Patricia described as old-fashioned clothing, a long dress of pale buckskin or similar material, decorated with geometric patterns. She walked slowly, deliberately, carrying something in her arms, wrapped in dark cloth. Patricia assumed the woman was part of a living history demonstration or cultural program. She called out a greeting, but the woman did not respond or turn around. Instead, she continued walking toward the water's edge, where the coulee meets the river. Gerald Novotny began walking after her, intending to ask about the program. But when he reached the spot where the woman had been standing moments before, she was gone. The riverbank was empty. The water flowed undisturbed. There was no bridge, no boat, no obvious place she could have concealed herself. What troubled Gerald most, he told a ranger later that afternoon, were the footprints. A clear trail of impressions led from the gravel path down to the water's edge, small, narrow prints, consistent with moccasins or soft-soled shoes. They stopped at the river. They did not continue on the opposite bank. They did not turn around. The ranger who took the Novotny's statement was a seasonal employee named Donald Eaglefeather, a member of the Crow Nation who had worked at the battlefield for 2 summers. According to Patricia's letter, Eaglefeather listened to their account without surprise. He wrote nothing down. When Gerald asked if anyone else had reported similar experiences, Eaglefeather said only that the river has many visitors. He did not elaborate. Over the following 3 decades, 10 more witnesses reported nearly identical encounters at the Medicine Tail Ford. The accounts were collected piecemeal, some filed with the Park Service, others recorded in letters to local newspapers, a few preserved only in personal journals or family correspondence that surfaced years later. In 1978, a retired schoolteacher from Bozeman named Harriet Lindstrom described seeing an Indian grandmother walking toward the river while carrying a bundle wrapped in what looked like a wool blanket. In 1983, a photographer from Denver named Joaquin Esparza reported following an elderly woman in traditional dress down the coulee path, only to lose sight of her completely when she reached the water. In 1991, a park volunteer named Sandra Whitehawk, herself a member of the Northern Cheyenne, encountered the figure while conducting an evening patrol of the lower battlefield. Whitehawk's account, recorded in an internal memo dated September 3, 1991, is among the most detailed. She described the woman as appearing to be in her 70s or 80s, with deeply lined skin and hair that had gone entirely white. The woman walked with a slight limp, favoring her left leg. She carried a bundle against her chest, cradling it as one might hold an infant. "She didn't look at me," Whitehawk wrote. "She didn't look at anything except the river. It was like she knew exactly where she was going and nothing was going to stop her." Whitehawk followed at a distance of approximately 30 feet. She watched the woman descend the final slope to the riverbank, step onto the wet sand at the water's edge, and then simply cease to be visible. There was no splash, no ripple, no indication that anyone had entered the water. Whitehawk walked to the same spot within seconds. The footprints were their clear impressions in the damp sand, ending at the waterline. She reported the incident to her supervisor the following morning. No investigation was conducted. The Park Service has never officially acknowledged the sightings. Internal correspondence obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests reveals that multiple incident reports were filed between 1971 and 2003, but none were assigned case numbers or investigated beyond the initial documentation. A memo from the Regional Superintendent's Office dated February of 1992 instructed staff to direct visitor inquiries about alleged apparitions to standard interpretive materials and to avoid speculation about phenomena not supported by historical record. In 1996, a cultural anthropologist from the University of Montana named Dr. Miriam Stonecrow attempted to compile a comprehensive study of the sightings. Stonecrow, who specialized in Northern Plains oral traditions, interviewed 6 of the 11 known witnesses and collected supplementary accounts from Crow and Cheyenne community members who had heard similar stories passed down through their families. Her research revealed a striking pattern. All 11 witnesses described the same basic figure, an elderly woman, Native American, wearing traditional clothing, carrying a wrapped bundle. All 11 described her walking toward the river. All 11 reported that her footprints ended at the water's edge, without explanation. But the most consistent detail, the one that appeared in every single account, was what the witnesses believed she was carrying. Something she was giving back, Harriet Lindstrom said in her 1996 interview. That's how it felt, like she was returning something that didn't belong to her. Esparza described the bundle as maybe the size of a loaf of bread, wrapped up tight. Whitehawk estimated it at roughly 18 inches long. Patricia Novotny remembered thinking it looked heavy for its size. The woman held it with both arms, pressed close to her body, as if protecting it. None of the witnesses could say what was inside the cloth. None of them saw her unwrap it. None of them saw her reach the water. Dr. Stonecrow submitted her findings to the American Journal of Folklore in 1998. The paper was rejected. Reviewer comments, which Stonecrow later shared in a conference presentation, described the research as anecdotal and insufficiently rigorous for academic publication. One reviewer suggested that the witnesses had simply observed a living person, perhaps a local resident or reenactor, and embellished their memories over time. Stonecrow pointed out that the sightings spanned 32 years, that the witnesses came from different states, different backgrounds, different age groups, that none of them had any prior knowledge of the other reports. The journal did not reconsider. The last known sighting occurred on June 21, 2003. A retired insurance adjuster from Minnesota named Wallace Bjornson was photographing wildflowers along the Medicine Tail Path when he noticed an elderly woman standing at the river's edge. He raised his camera to take a photograph. By the time he looked through the viewfinder, she was gone. His camera captured only the empty riverbank, the water, the cottonwoods, the footprints leading nowhere. Bjornson filed a report with the Park Service the following day. It was acknowledged with a form letter. No follow-up was conducted. 21 years have passed since that sighting. No new reports have been documented, or at least none have been made public. The Medicine Tail Ford remains open to visitors. The interpretive signs describe the battle, the terrain, the strategic significance of the crossing. They make no mention of the woman, but the Crow elders still warn their grandchildren about the ford. They tell them that some people walk to the river carrying things they cannot keep. They tell them that the water accepts what is offered, and that those who give something back do not always return. They do not explain what was taken. They do not explain what is being returned. The footprints still appear. Some say faint impressions in the wet sand after rain, gone by morning, always leading to the water, never coming back. The river keeps flowing. The woman keeps walking. And whatever she carries remains wrapped in cloth, pressed against her chest, waiting to be given back to something only she can see. There are places where the earth pulls in directions it should not, and there are places where even instruments lose their way. Calhoun Hill occupies the southeastern flank of the Little Bighorn battlefield, rising modestly from the prairie approximately 1 mile from Last Stand Hill. It is named for Lieutenant James Calhoun, commander of Company L of the 7th Cavalry and brother-in-law to George Armstrong Custer. On June 25, 1876, Calhoun and his men were positioned here as part of Custer's defensive line, tasked with holding the right flank against the thousands of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors advancing from the valley below. They held for perhaps 20 minutes. Then they were overrun. Today, the hill is marked by a cluster of white marble headstones, 42 in total, arranged in a rough semicircle on the grassy slope. Each stone represents a soldier who fell within yards of this position. Unlike the scattered markers elsewhere on the battlefield, these stand close together, almost touching in places, as if the men had drawn toward each other in their final moments. The formation has an accidental symmetry, a geometry that suggests not military order, but something more primal, the instinct to gather when surrounded, to face the end together. The terrain around Calhoun Hill is unremarkable. The soil is the same clay-heavy composition found throughout southeastern Montana. The bedrock beneath is sedimentary, primarily sandstone and shale deposited during the Cretaceous period. There are no significant mineral deposits, no volcanic intrusions, no underground formations that might account for magnetic irregularity. And yet, since at least 1929, compasses have behaved strangely here. The first documented observation came from a surveying team contracted by the War Department to establish precise boundary markers for the newly designated national monument. The team, led by a civil engineer named Frederick Holmgren, spent 3 weeks at Little Bighorn in the summer of 1929, mapping terrain features and recording elevation data. Holmgren's field notes, preserved in the National Archives, contain a brief but puzzling entry dated July 17th. Compass readings, inconsistent at Calhoun position, he wrote. Repeated measurements show needle deflecting approximately 11 degrees east of expected magnetic north. Checked instrument against control readings at Visitor Center, no malfunction detected. Anomaly appears localized to area surrounding marker cluster. Holmgren noted the discrepancy, but offered no explanation. His final survey maps included a small annotation indicating local magnetic variation at Calhoun Hill. The War Department accepted the maps without comment. No follow-up investigation was requested. For nearly 4 decades, the anomaly remained a footnote known to surveyors and cartographers who worked the site but never formally studied. Then, in 1967, the U.S. Geological Survey dispatched a team to conduct a comprehensive magnetic survey of the battlefield as part of a broader regional mapping project. The team was led by Dr. Arthur Pembroke, a geophysicist from the USGS Denver office who specialized in paleomagnetic studies. His crew included 3 field technicians and a graduate student from the Colorado School of Mines named Janet Soderquist. They arrived at Little Bighorn on September 4, 1967. With equipment designed to measure magnetic field intensity, declination, and inclination at multiple points across the monument. The survey proceeded normally for the first 2 days. Readings at Last Stand Hill, the Deep Ravine, and the Reno Benteen Defense Site all fell within expected parameters. Minor variations were noted but easily attributed to standard geological factors. On September 6th, the team moved to Calhoun Hill. According to field logs later submitted to the USGS Regional Office, the crew set up their magnetometer station approximately 15 yards from the nearest marble marker at 9:45 in the morning. Initial readings confirmed Holmgren's observation from 38 years earlier. The magnetic declination at this location deviated 11.3 degrees east of the expected value. Pembroke ordered multiple measurements from different positions around the marker cluster. Each reading showed the same deviation, varying by less than half a degree. The team spent the next several hours attempting to identify a cause. They tested for buried metal objects using a handheld detector. They examined the marble headstones for iron content. They checked their instruments against calibrated references brought from Denver. Everything functioned correctly. The anomaly persisted. At approximately 4:15 in the afternoon, Pembroke decided to conduct a final series of measurements before breaking for the day. Soderquist was operating the primary magnetometer, while technician Raymond Delacroix recorded data, and technician Michael Ogunyemi monitored the backup instruments. At 4:32, according to Soderquist's handwritten log, all three instruments failed simultaneously. The magnetometer's needle, which had been holding steady at its anomalous reading, began spinning erratically. The backup unit displayed readings that fluctuated wildly between positive and negative values. A portable compass carried by Delacroix, a standard Silva model used for field navigation, reportedly spun 3 complete rotations before settling on a bearing that pointed directly at the center of the marker cluster. The malfunction lasted approximately 90 seconds. Then, as suddenly as it began, the equipment returned to normal operation. The magnetometer stabilized. The backup readings normalized. Delacroix's compass pointed north, true magnetic north, not the 11-degree deviation they had measured all day. The anomaly had vanished. Pembroke ordered the team to repeat their measurements. For the next 2 hours, until fading light forced them to stop, they recorded readings from every position they had tested that morning. Every measurement now fell within normal parameters. The 11-degree deviation was gone, as if it had never existed. The team returned the following morning. The anomaly had returned. Soderquist, in a letter to a colleague at the Colorado School of Mines, dated September 20th, 1967, described the experience as deeply unsettling in ways I find difficult to articulate. She noted that 4:32 in the afternoon corresponded almost exactly to the time based on the sun's position and historical estimates when the fighting reached Calhoun Hill on June 25, 1876. "I am not a superstitious person," she wrote, "but I cannot explain what happened to our instruments. I cannot explain why it happened at that specific moment, and I cannot explain why the anomaly disappeared for precisely 90 seconds before returning." The USGS final report on the Little Bighorn survey, submitted in January of 1968, made no mention of the 4:32 incident. It acknowledged the 11-degree deviation at Calhoun Hill as a localized magnetic anomaly of undetermined origin and recommended further study. No further study was funded. Pembroke retired from the USGS in 1974. He declined all requests for interviews about the Little Bighorn survey until his death in 1991. Soderquist left the field of geophysics entirely in 1970, transitioning to a career in secondary education. When contacted by a researcher in 2008, she confirmed the accuracy of her 1967 letter, but refused to discuss the incident further. "Some things don't have explanations," she reportedly said, "and some explanations wouldn't help even if we had them." The compass anomaly at Calhoun Hill has been independently verified at least 7 times since 1967. A National Park Service maintenance crew reported the deviation in 1983 while installing new interpretive signage. A group of Boy Scouts on a 1995 educational visit documented it as part of a navigation exercise. A paranormal research team recorded it in 2011 using both analog and digital compasses. Each observation has shown the same deviation, 11 degrees east of magnetic north. Each observation has been localized to the same area, a roughly circular zone, approximately 40 yards in diameter, centered on the cluster of Calhoun markers. No geological explanation has ever been accepted. Theories have been proposed: buried ordnance, natural magnetite deposits, residual magnetization from the battle itself, but none have withstood scrutiny. The soil has been tested. The bedrock has been sampled. The markers have been analyzed. Nothing accounts for the anomaly. The 4:32 phenomenon has never been replicated under controlled conditions. No subsequent research team has reported simultaneous equipment failure at that time. But several visitors have noted something peculiar in the years since. Watches and phones occasionally lose a minute or two near the Calhoun markers, displaying times that do not match devices carried by companions standing just yards away. The Park Service attributes these reports to battery fluctuations, signal interference, or simple misreading. They do not officially acknowledge the compass anomaly. Interpretive materials at Calhoun Hill describe only the historical events of June 25, 1876, the positions of the soldiers, the advance of the warriors, the collapse of the defensive line. They do not mention that the Earth here still pulls in a direction it should not. Lieutenant James Calhoun's body was found near the center of what is now the marker cluster. According to accounts from soldiers who arrived 2 days after the battle, he had been shot through the chest and lay facing east 11 degrees south of the direction he would have faced if oriented toward true magnetic north. 11 degrees. The same deviation, the same direction. Perhaps it means nothing. Perhaps the coincidence is only that, a coincidence, a trick of numbers, a pattern imposed by minds that seek meaning where none exists. But compasses do not lie. They point where the Earth tells them to point, and at Calhoun Hill, the Earth still tells them to point somewhere else. Some things happen at the same time every night. Some things have been happening for longer than anyone wants to admit. The Visitor Center at Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument was constructed in 1952, a modest single-story building of native sandstone and timber designed to blend with the Montana landscape. It sits on a low rise approximately 300 yards from Last Stand Hill, oriented so that its west-facing windows look out over the valley where the Little Bighorn River winds through cottonwood groves toward the Crow Reservation. During daylight hours, the view is serene, rolling grassland, distant ridgelines, the white marble headstones dotting the hills like scattered teeth. At night, the visitor center is empty, or it should be. From 1952 until 1979, the National Park Service employed a single overnight custodian to maintain the building, perform light cleaning duties, and provide security during non-operating hours. The position required residency in a small apartment attached to the rear of the facility, a Spartan arrangement that offered little beyond running water, a wood stove, and isolation. The first custodian was a man named Virgil Running Crane, a veteran of the Second World War and a member of the Crow Nation whose family had lived in the shadow of the battlefield for generations. Running Crane took the position in August of 1952 and held it until his retirement in November of 1978. 26 years of nights spent alone in a building overlooking one of the most storied killing fields in American history. As part of his duties, Running Crane was required to maintain a logbook documenting any incidents, maintenance issues, or unusual occurrences observed during his shift. The logbook was a standard Park Service requirement, intended primarily for tracking equipment failures, pest sightings, and security concerns. Running Crane fulfilled this obligation meticulously, filling 23 bound notebooks over the course of his tenure. When he retired, the logbooks were boxed and transferred to the Park Service Regional Archive in Billings, where they remained untouched for over 2 decades. In 2001, a graduate student named Eleanor Vance submitted a Freedom of Information Act request for historical maintenance records from Little Bighorn as part of her doctoral research on federal infrastructure at national monuments. The request was approved, and Vance received 16 boxes of documents, including Running Crane's logbooks. What she found inside would occupy her for the next 3 years. The logbooks began routinely enough. Running Crane documented burned-out light bulbs, frozen pipes, rodent activity in the storage rooms, and occasional visits from deer that wandered too close to the building. His entries were terse and practical, the observations of a man accustomed to solitude and disinclined toward elaboration. Then, on March 14, 1956, the entries changed. 3:17 a.m., Running Crane wrote. Smell near west windows. Horses and powder smoke. Strong. Gone by 3:21. The entry was unremarkable in isolation, perhaps a trick of memory, a draft carrying scents from a distant ranch, a dream that lingered into waking. But the following night, Running Crane recorded the same observation, and the night after that, and the night after that. Over the next 22 years, Running Crane documented the phenomenon 847 times. The entries varied slightly in wording but never in substance. The smell appeared at 3:17 in the morning. It lasted exactly 4 minutes. It was always concentrated near the west-facing windows. It always smelled the same: horse sweat and gunpowder, the scent of cavalry in motion. Vance compiled the entries chronologically and found remarkable consistency. Running Crane missed logging the phenomenon only during periods of documented illness, vacation, or extreme weather that prevented him from reaching the west wing of the building. On every other night he was present, he recorded the smell. "I have worked in archives for 15 years," Vance wrote in her preliminary research notes. "I have never encountered documentation this consistent over this length of time." Either Running Crane fabricated 847 entries across 22 years for no discernible reason, or he experienced exactly what he described. Vance attempted to contact Running Crane in 2002, hoping to conduct an interview. She learned that he had died in 1989, 11 years after his retirement. His family, still living on the Crow Reservation, declined to speak with her. A niece, reached by telephone, said only that her uncle never talked about his time at the visitor center, and that the family had no interest in revisiting those years. The logbooks contained other details that Vance found significant. On 17 occasions, Running Crane noted that the smell was accompanied by a sound, a low rumbling, like distant hoofbeats, that seemed to come from the direction of the valley. On 4 occasions, he reported that the west windows had fogged inexplicably during the 4-minute window, despite interior temperatures that should have prevented condensation. On one occasion, November 12, 1971, he wrote simply, "Smell stronger tonight. Saw shapes in the fog on the glass. Did not look closely." He never elaborated on what he meant by shapes. He never mentioned the incident again. Vance submitted a formal research inquiry to the National Park Service in 2003, requesting access to any additional documentation related to Running Crane's employment or the decision to eliminate the overnight custodian position. The response, received 4 months later, stated that personnel records from the relevant period had been transferred to off-site storage and were not currently available for review. A subsequent FOIA request for the specific records was denied on the grounds that they contained personally identifiable information exempt from disclosure. Vance did manage to locate 2 former Park Service employees who had worked at Little Bighorn during Running Crane's tenure. The first, a retired ranger named Harold Bocage, served at the monument from 1968 to 1974. He remembered Running Crane as quiet and competent, but acknowledged that staff rarely interacted with the night custodian. He kept to himself. Bocage said in a 2003 interview, "I saw him maybe a dozen times in 6 years. He always looked tired, not sleepy, tired in a different way, like he was carrying something heavy." When asked about the logbook entries, Bocage said he had never read them, but he recalled a conversation from his first year at the monument, when a senior ranger warned him not to visit the visitor center after midnight. "He said Virgil had enough to deal with without us adding to it," Bocage recalled. "I asked what he meant. He just shook his head and said some buildings have longer memories than others." The second former employee, a maintenance supervisor named Dolores Yazzie, worked at Little Bighorn from 1975 to 1982. She was present when the overnight custodian position was eliminated in 1979. "There was no explanation," Yazzie said. "One day we had a night custodian, the next day we didn't. The apartment was sealed up. We were told the position was no longer operationally necessary. Nobody questioned it. You didn't question things like that back then." Yazzie admitted that she had entered the visitor center alone after hours on 2 occasions during her tenure, both times to retrieve forgotten equipment. She did not experience anything unusual, but she noted that both visits occurred before 3 in the morning. "I always made sure to be out by 3," she said. "I don't know why, just a feeling." Vance published her findings in a 2005 article for a regional historical journal. The article generated modest interest among researchers and battlefield enthusiasts, but received no response from the National Park Service. Her requests for comment were never acknowledged. The visitor center at Little Bighorn remains in operation today, though it has been extensively renovated since Running Crane's time. The west-facing windows were replaced in 1992 as part of an energy efficiency upgrade. The apartment where Running Crane lived was converted to administrative storage in 1981. No overnight custodian has been employed at the monument since 1979. Security is now provided by motion sensors, cameras, and periodic patrols from rangers stationed elsewhere on the reservation. The building stands empty from closing time until morning. Vance attempted to arrange an overnight visit to the visitor center in 2006, hoping to observe whether the phenomenon continued. Her request was denied. Park Service correspondents cited liability concerns and the absence of documented justification for after-hours access. She never received permission. Virgil Running Crane left no personal papers, no diaries, no correspondence that might illuminate his 22 years of nightly observations. His family has maintained their silence. His logbooks remain in the Billings archive, available to researchers who know to ask for them. 847 entries. 3:17 in the morning. 4 minutes exactly. The smell of horses. The smell of gunpowder. The smell of something that happened 130 years before Running Crane first noticed it, and may still be happening now, in the hours when no one is there to record it. The visitor center's west windows face the valley. They face the direction from which the cavalry came on that June afternoon in 1876, riding toward a battle they did not expect and would not survive. At 3:17 in the morning, on the night of June 25, 1876, the soldiers of the 7th Cavalry would have been asleep in their tents, 12 hours away from death. Why the smell comes at that hour, no one knows. Why it lasts exactly 4 minutes, no one knows. Why it stopped being documented in 1978, or whether it stopped at all, no one knows. Virgil Running Crane knew. He wrote it down, night after night, year after year, in the quiet handwriting of a man who had learned not to be surprised by what the darkness brought. He never explained what he thought it meant. Perhaps he understood that some explanations are not his to give. The logbooks remain. The entries remain. The question remains. And at 3:17 in the morning, in a building where no one is watching, the west windows look out over a valley where horses once ran, and something, perhaps, is still running. Children sometimes know things they cannot possibly know, and sometimes the knowing leaves no trace behind. Custer National Cemetery occupies the northern edge of Little Bighorn Battlefield, a carefully maintained expanse of white headstones arranged in precise rows on a gentle slope overlooking the monument's visitor center. The cemetery was established in 1879, 3 years after the battle, to provide a permanent resting place for soldiers who died in conflicts across the northern plains. Today, it holds the remains of over 5,000 veterans from wars spanning the Civil War to Vietnam, their graves marked by identical marble stones inscribed with names, ranks, and dates of service. The cemetery is distinct from the battlefield markers, those scattered white stones, that indicate where individual soldiers fell during the June 1876 engagement. The battlefield markers bear no names, only the designation U.S. Soldier, 7th Cavalry, and occasionally a small notation indicating that remains were later relocated. The men who died at Little Bighorn were buried hastily in shallow graves by the relief column that arrived 2 days after the battle, and most were reinterred in a mass grave beneath the granite memorial on Last Stand Hill in 1881. Positive identification of individual remains was rarely possible. But the cemetery holds other dead soldiers from other battles, other decades, other circumstances. Their stories are preserved in military records, pension files, and regimental histories housed in archives across the country. Their names are carved in stone. Their service is documented. What is not documented is how a 5-year-old boy from suburban Columbus, Ohio, came to know 7 of those names before he could read them. The incident occurred on July 19, 1994. The Ketterman family, Richard and Diane, both certified public accountants, and their son, Ethan, arrived at Little Bighorn battlefield shortly after 10 in the morning. They were midway through a 2-week road trip to Yellowstone, stopping at historical sites along the route as part of what Richard later described as an educational vacation. Neither parent had any particular interest in military history. Neither had visited the battlefield before. Ethan was 5 years and 3 months old. He had not yet entered kindergarten. According to his parents, he could recognize letters and some simple words, but could not read sentences. He had never expressed interest in the Civil War, the Indian Wars, or any aspect of American military history. His favorite books were about dinosaurs and construction vehicles. The family toured the visitor center, watched the introductory film, and walked the interpretive trail to Last Stand Hill. They took photographs at the memorial and ate a packed lunch at one of the designated picnic areas near the cemetery. It was a routine visit, unremarkable in every way. Then Ethan began walking. Diane Ketterman described what happened next in a notarized statement provided to researcher James Whitfield in 2003. He just got up from the picnic table and started walking toward the cemetery. He wasn't running, he walked very deliberately, like he knew exactly where he was going. Richard called after him, but he didn't turn around. We followed him. Ethan walked directly to a headstone in the 4th row of the cemetery's eastern section. He stopped in front of it, looked at the inscription for a moment, and then said clearly, "Sergeant William Briody, Company G." He was from New York. The headstone read only, "William Briody, SGT, U.S. Army." Richard Ketterman assumed his son had somehow read the inscription, despite his limited reading ability, but the stone did not include a company designation or state of origin. That information existed only in archived military service records held at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis. Before either parent could respond, Ethan walked to another headstone, approximately 30 yards away. "Private Thomas Cavanaugh," he said. Company F. He was from Massachusetts. He moved to a 3rd stone. Corporal Henry Bringes, Company C, Pennsylvania. Over the next 40 minutes, Ethan identified 7 soldiers by full name, rank, company, and home state. He did not hesitate. He did not look to his parents for confirmation. He walked directly to each grave as if he had visited them many times before, spoke the information clearly, and moved on. Richard and Diane followed in silence, too confused to intervene. A park ranger named Luis Delgado observed part of the incident and approached the family after Ethan finished. Delgado later filed an internal report documenting what he had witnessed. "The boy showed no distress," Delgado wrote, "no excitement. He stated the information matter-of-factly, like a tour guide who had given the same talk 100 times. When he finished, he walked back to the picnic table and asked for a juice box. He seemed completely unaware that anything unusual had occurred." Diane Ketterman insisted that her son had never demonstrated any prior knowledge of the soldiers or the battlefield. "We don't have military history books in the house," she told Delgado. "We don't watch war movies. He's 5. He thinks the Civil War was about robots. I don't know how to explain what we just saw." Delgado attempted to verify the boy's statements using the cemetery's administrative records, which were kept in a file cabinet at the visitor center. The records confirmed that all 7 soldiers Ethan had identified were buried at the locations he indicated, with ranks, companies, and home states matching his descriptions exactly. The information Ethan provided was not displayed anywhere on the monuments. It was not included in visitor guides, interpretive materials, or the introductory film. The only comprehensive source for such details was the War Department's muster rolls and pension files, archived hundreds of miles away in facilities the Ketterman family had never visited. Delgado reported the incident to his supervisor that evening. He recommended that the family be contacted for follow-up and that the case be documented for future reference. His supervisor acknowledged the report, but took no further action. "I was told it was a curiosity, not a concern," Delgado said in a 2004 interview. "They said kids sometimes pick up information in strange ways. Maybe he'd seen a documentary at a relative's house, or overheard something at school. They didn't want to make a federal case out of a little boy reciting some names." But Delgado remained troubled by one detail that he did not include in his official report. Two of the soldiers Ethan had identified, Private Thomas Cavanaugh and Corporal Henry Bringes, were not originally buried at Little Bighorn. Their remains had been transferred from other posts in 1882 and 1885, respectively. There were no markers at the cemetery indicating their prior burial locations or the circumstances of their transfer. Ethan had not only known their names, he had known they belonged at this cemetery, a fact that even most historians would need archival research to confirm. The Ketterman family completed their vacation and returned to Ohio without further incident. Richard contacted the Park Service 3 weeks later, requesting a copy of Delgado's report, hoping to document the experience for their own records. He received a form letter stating that internal incident reports were not available for public release. In 1998, a psychologist at Ohio State University named Dr. Meredith Ashworth learned of the case through a colleague who had heard the story secondhand at a conference. Ashworth, whose research focused on anomalous memory phenomena in children, contacted the Ketterman family and requested permission to interview Ethan, who was then 9 years old. Ethan remembered nothing. Under careful questioning, he exhibited no recognition of the soldiers' names, no memory of the cemetery visit, and no particular interest in military history. Ashworth administered standardized memory assessments and found his cognitive development entirely normal for his age. He showed no signs of dissociative disorders, exceptional recall abilities, or other psychological anomalies. "It was as if the experience had been completely erased," Ashworth wrote in a confidential case summary. The parents' accounts were consistent and detailed, and the Rangers' report corroborated their observations. But the subject himself retained no conscious memory of the event whatsoever. Ashworth attempted to publish her findings in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology in 2001. The paper was rejected by peer review. One reviewer commented that the case, while intriguing, could not be verified through independent evidence, and therefore failed to meet evidentiary standards for publication. Another suggested that the parents may have inadvertently coached or primed the child prior to the visit, a possibility both Richard and Diane adamantly denied. Ashworth's research notes were archived with her personal papers when she retired in 2012. They have never been made publicly available. Luis Delgado left the Park Service in 2005 after 17 years of employment. In his exit interview, he was asked if any particular experiences at Little Bighorn had affected his decision to retire. He mentioned the Ketterman case by name. "I've seen a lot of strange things at that battlefield," he said, "but that little boy walking to those graves, saying those names, like he'd known them his whole life, that's the one I think about. That's the one I can't explain." Ethan Ketterman is 35 years old today. He works as a software engineer in Denver. He has no recollection of his family's 1994 visit to Little Bighorn, though he has seen the photographs his parents took that day. He has never returned to the battlefield. When contacted by researchers in 2019, he declined to be interviewed. Through a brief email exchange, he confirmed only that his parents had told him the story many times over the years, and that he had no reason to doubt their account. "But I don't remember it," he wrote. "It's like hearing about something that happened to someone else. I believe them. I just can't connect it to me." The 7 soldiers Ethan identified remain buried at Custer National Cemetery. Their headstones bear the same simple inscriptions they have carried for over a century. Visitors walk past them every day without pausing. Somewhere in the National Archives, their service records preserve the details Ethan spoke aloud on that July afternoon. Ranks, companies, home states, information a 5-year-old boy could not have known, should not have known, and now claims never to have known at all. The names were correct, every single one. And the boy who said them has forgotten everything except the certainty that something happened that day, something he cannot touch, something that left no memory but left its mark all the same. Sometimes the dead have something left to say. Sometimes they say it, whether anyone is listening or not. The interpretive walking trail at Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument winds for approximately 4.5 miles through the heart of the monument, connecting the major sites of the June 1876 engagement. The trail begins near the visitor center and descends through rolling shortgrass prairie toward Medicine Tail Coulee, rises again to Calhoun Hill, and terminates at the Granite Memorial on Last Stand Hill. Along the way, numbered markers correspond to entries in the official trail guide, offering visitors historical context for the terrain they are crossing. The landscape has changed remarkably little since the battle. The same species of grass, blue grama, buffalo grass, western wheatgrass cover the slopes in summer. The same cottonwoods line the river valley below. The same wind sweeps across the ridgelines, carrying the dry scent of sage and the faint hum of insects in the afternoon heat. On quiet days, when no tour buses idle in the parking lot and no families chatter along the path, the battlefield can feel utterly empty, a place suspended between centuries, belonging fully to neither. It was on such a day that a small documentary crew arrived to capture what they described as the ambient sound of history. The production was a modest affair. Prairie Silence Films, a two-person company based in Missoula, specialized in atmospheric documentaries about overlooked historical sites in the northern plains. Their previous work included short films about abandoned homesteads in eastern Montana and the ghost towns of the Idaho Panhandle. The Little Bighorn project was intended as their most ambitious production to date, a meditative exploration of the battlefield without narration or interviews, relying entirely on natural sound and slow-moving imagery. The crew consisted of director and cinematographer Nathaniel Isaacson and audio engineer Priya Bhattacharya. They arrived at the monument on October 14, 2007, equipped with a high-definition camera, a portable sound recorder, and a pair of shotgun microphones designed to capture directional audio at significant distances. The weather was ideal for their purposes. Partly cloudy, wind under 10 miles per hour, no rain in the forecast. They obtained a filming permit from the Park Service and began work shortly after sunrise, walking the interpretive trail with their equipment and recording extended takes at each major landmark. By mid-afternoon, they had reached a section of the trail between Calhoun Hill and Last Stand Hill, a stretch of approximately half a mile that crosses open prairie with unobstructed views in all directions. Isaacson set up the camera on a tripod facing northwest, toward the river valley. Bhattacharya positioned her microphones to capture a wide stereo field, angling them slightly downward to minimize wind noise. They recorded for 11 minutes without interruption. Neither spoke during the take. The battlefield was empty. The nearest visitors, according to Bhattacharya's later account, were at least a quarter mile away near the visitor center. The recording session concluded without incident. They packed their equipment, completed the trail walk, and returned to Missoula that evening to begin post-production. 3 days later, Bhattacharya isolated something in the audio that neither of them had heard in the field. The anomaly appeared approximately 6 minutes and 40 seconds into the 11-minute recording. It lasted 17 seconds. Against the background of wind and grass, the expected ambient texture of the prairie, a second layer of sound emerged. It was faint, but distinct. Human voices, speaking in a rhythmic pattern that suggested language rather than random vocalization. Bhattacharya initially assumed the sound was contamination, perhaps a distant conversation carried by the wind, or radio interference picked up by the recording equipment. She checked the original file for digital artifacts and found none. She examined the waveform and confirmed that the voices occupied a frequency range consistent with natural human speech, not electronic distortion. The voices appeared to be speaking in a language neither she nor Isaacson recognized. Isaacson contacted a colleague at the University of Montana who specialized in indigenous languages of the Northern Plains. The colleague, Dr. Leonard Crow Feather, agreed to review the recording on condition of anonymity, a request he would later explain was due to institutional sensitivities surrounding the material. Dr. Crow Feather's analysis, summarized in an informal memo shared with Isaacson in November of 2007, concluded that the voices were speaking Lakota. The audio quality was poor, but certain phonetic patterns were identifiable. One phrase, repeated at least 3 times during the 17-second sequence, appeared to translate as, "We are still counting." The phrase was grammatically consistent with 19th century Lakota speech patterns. It was not a common expression in contemporary usage. Dr. Crowfeather could not identify its precise meaning or context. "Counting what?" Isaacson asked during a phone conversation. Dr. Crowfeather did not answer directly. He said only that counting the enumeration of the dead, of coups, of horses taken held significant cultural and spiritual meaning in Lakota warrior traditions. A count that continued after death would imply something unfinished, something that had not yet reached its end. He declined to speculate further. Isaacson and Bhattacharya submitted a formal request to the Park Service in December of 2007, asking permission to return to the battlefield for additional recording sessions. They explained their findings and proposed a controlled study to determine whether the anomaly could be replicated. Their request was denied. The rejection letter, dated January 8, 2008, cited concerns about the potential for misrepresentation of cultural and historical materials and stated that the monument was not an appropriate venue for paranormal investigation. The letter made no mention of their original filming permit, which had been granted without objection, and offered no explanation for why a second permit would not be considered. Isaacson appealed the decision. His appeal was acknowledged but never formally resolved. Follow-up inquiries went unanswered. By March of 2008, Prairie Silence Films had effectively abandoned the project. The original recording was never publicly released. Bhattacharya retained a copy on a personal hard drive, which she shared with a small number of researchers and audio specialists over the following years. Independent analyses yielded mixed conclusions. Some experts agreed that the voices appeared to be speaking Lakota. Others suggested the sounds might be pareidolia, the human tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random noise. None could definitively explain how voices speaking a Native American language had appeared on a recording made in an empty field with no other people present. In 2012, a graduate student at Montana State University named Caroline Fairbanks obtained a copy of the recording as part of her research into acoustic anomalies at historical sites. Fairbanks had the audio analyzed using spectrographic software capable of isolating individual frequency bands. Her findings, documented in an unpublished thesis, confirmed the presence of human vocal patterns in the 17-second segment and identified what appeared to be at least 3 distinct speakers. The speakers were not shouting or projecting. Their tone, Fairbanks wrote, was measured and deliberate, the cadence of a ritual or recitation, not a conversation. Fairbanks attempted to contact the Lakota Cultural Center in Pine Ridge, South Dakota, to request assistance with translation. Her emails went unanswered. A phone call to the center's administrative office was transferred twice before being disconnected. She did not try again. The Park Service has never acknowledged the 2007 recording. Internal correspondence obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request in 2015 contains no references to the incident, Prairie Silence Films, or any audio anomalies reported at the interpretive trail. The denial of Isaacson's filming permit is not mentioned in any available documentation. Dr. Leonard Crowfeather retired from the University of Montana in 2014. He has not spoken publicly about his analysis of the recording. When contacted by an independent researcher in 2018, he responded with a single sentence: "Some things are not meant to be translated." Nathaniel Isaacson left the documentary field in 2011 and now works as a wedding videographer in Seattle. Priya Bhattacharya continues to work in audio engineering, primarily for commercial clients. neither has returned to Little Bighorn. The interpretive trail remains open to visitors. Hundreds of people walk its length each week during the summer season, pausing at the numbered markers, reading from the official guide, taking photographs of the prairie and the distant hills. The wind still moves through the grass. The silence still settles over the ridgelines when the crowds thin. And somewhere in that silence, if the recording is to be believed, voices continue to speak, not calling out, not crying for help, just counting something that the living cannot see. The Lakota phrase, as Dr. Crow Feather translated it, contains no verb tense indicating completion. We are still counting does not mean the counting will end. It means the counting has not ended yet. What they are counting and how high the number has reached, the recording does not say. Perhaps they are waiting for someone to ask. Perhaps they have been waiting for a very long time. The 17 seconds play on. In a file stored on a hard drive in a studio in Missoula, a fragment of sound captured on a quiet October afternoon, in a place where no one was speaking, where no one should have been heard. But someone was, and they are still counting. Water has memory, and some water remembers what it would rather forget. The Little Bighorn River flows north through southeastern Montana, descending from the Wolf Mountains toward its confluence with the Bighorn River near the town of Hardin. It is not a large waterway, rarely more than 50 feet wide, and seldom deeper than 4 feet, except during spring snowmelt, but it has shaped the landscape and history of the region for millennia. The Crow people called it the Greasy Grass, a name that referenced the lush vegetation along its banks. For the Lakota and Cheyenne who camped beside it in the summer of 1876, it was a source of life, sustenance, and ultimately, strategic advantage. The river crossing near Medicine Tail Coulee is one of the most studied locations on the battlefield. Historians believe that Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer intended to ford the river here, striking the massive village from an unexpected angle while Major Reno's battalion attacked from the south. The plan failed. Custer's column was driven back before reaching the water, forced onto the ridgelines where they would make their final stand. But Cheyenne oral histories tell a different story, one in which some soldiers did reach the river. According to accounts preserved by tribal historians, a small group of cavalrymen broke through the defensive line and attempted to cross the ford, perhaps seeking to rejoin Reno's command or to escape the encirclement closing around them. They never made it to the opposite bank. The location described in these accounts corresponds to a shallow stretch of the river, approximately 300 yards downstream from the main ford, a quiet bend where the current slows and the riverbed turns to smooth, water-polished stone. For over a century, this section of the Little Bighorn appeared unremarkable. Then, in 2012, a thermal imaging survey revealed something that had been invisible to the naked eye. The survey was conducted by a team from the University of Wyoming's Remote Sensing Laboratory, led by Dr. Catherine Johansson, a specialist in archaeological applications of infrared imaging. The project's goal was to identify subsurface features, old foundations, buried fire pits, or concentrations of organic material that might indicate previously undocumented sites of human activity on the battlefield. The team arrived in late August, when the summer heat had warmed the prairie soil to temperatures ideal for thermal contrast imaging. They spent 4 days scanning the monument from a low-flying helicopter equipped with a forward-looking infrared camera capable of detecting temperature differentials as small as 1/10 of a degree Celsius. Most of the survey yielded expected results: faint thermal signatures marking old trail beds, subtle variations indicating changes in soil composition, and the predictable patterns of vegetation responding to afternoon sun. The river itself appeared as a dark ribbon on the thermal display, cooler than the surrounding land, as moving water typically is. But on the afternoon of August 23rd, approximately 2 miles downstream from the visitor center, the camera detected something unusual. A 50-foot section of the river registered significantly colder than the water immediately upstream or downstream. The temperature differential was not subtle. It measured approximately 8 degrees Fahrenheit, a gap far larger than any natural variation the team had observed elsewhere along the waterway. The cold zone appeared as a distinct band across the thermal display, its edges sharply defined, rather than gradually blending into the warmer currents on either side. Dr. Johansen ordered the pilot to make 3 additional passes over the location. Each pass confirmed the anomaly. The cold zone remained stable, its boundaries unchanging, its temperature consistent. The team landed near the site and deployed handheld thermal sensors to verify the helicopter readings. Ground-level measurements confirmed the 8-degree differential. The water within the 50-foot zone was markedly colder than the water flowing into it from upstream, a physical impossibility under normal hydrological conditions. Graduate student Marcus Aurelio Reyes waded into the river to take direct temperature readings with a calibrated digital thermometer. His measurements matched the infrared data precisely: 71 degrees Fahrenheit in the main channel, 63 degrees within the anomalous zone. "I felt it before I saw the numbers," Reyes said in a 2014 interview. "The cold hit my legs like I'd stepped into a different river entirely. It was sharp, not gradual like you'd expect from a spring or a tributary. One moment the water was warm, the next it was cold, and then warm again when I walked through to the other side. There was no visible source for the cold water. No tributary entered the river at that point. No springs bubbled up from the riverbed." The team used ground-penetrating sonar to map the substrate beneath the anomaly and found only the same sandstone and gravel present throughout the river's course. Dr. Johansen contacted the U.S. Geological Survey Office in Billings to request historical data on the river's thermal profile. The USGS had conducted temperature studies of the Little Bighorn in 1978 and 1994 as part of regional water quality assessments. Neither study included measurements from the specific location of the 2012 anomaly, but general data suggested that temperature variations along the river's length rarely exceeded 2 degrees under normal summer conditions. 8 degrees was not normal. 8 degrees was, according to one USGS hydrologist, who reviewed the data informally, outside the range of natural explanation. The team remained at the site for 2 additional days, documenting the anomaly under varying conditions. They recorded measurements at dawn, midday, dusk, and midnight. The 8-degree differential persisted regardless of ambient air temperature, cloud cover, or time of day. The cold zone did not expand, contract, or shift position. It occupied the same 50-foot stretch of river, hour after hour, as if fixed in place by something other than the current. On their final day at the site, Johansen consulted with a Cheyenne cultural liaison named Arlene Standing Bear, who had been assigned to the project by the Northern Cheyenne Tribal Council. Standing Bear listened to the team's findings without visible reaction. When asked if she knew of any traditional stories associated with that section of the river, she was silent for a long moment. "My grandmother told me about that place," she finally said. "She said soldiers tried to cross there. She said they went into the water and never came out the other side. She said the river kept them." Standing Bear declined to elaborate. She asked that her name not be included in any published reports, a request Johansen honored until Standing Bear's death in 2019. The University of Wyoming submitted a preliminary report to the National Park Service in October of 2012, summarizing the thermal findings and requesting permission for a follow-up hydrological study. The Park Service acknowledged receipt of the report but issued no response to the research request. In 2014, Johansen resubmitted the proposal with additional data from a second thermal survey conducted the previous summer. The anomaly had persisted, unchanged in location, size, or temperature differential. Her proposal was denied. The rejection letter cited insufficient scientific justification for extended research access and noted that the monument's primary mission was historical interpretation, not environmental study. Johansen published a brief summary of her findings in the Journal of Archaeological Science in 2015. The paper described the thermal anomaly in technical terms and proposed several hypothetical explanations: an undocumented aquifer, localized geothermal activity, unusual sediment composition, while acknowledging that none of these theories withstood scrutiny upon investigation. The paper received little attention within the academic community. Two peer reviewers noted that the anomaly, while intriguing, did not fall within the journal's primary focus on archaeological methodology. A third reviewer questioned whether the measurements had been properly calibrated, despite Johansson's detailed documentation of her procedures. No other research team has been granted access to study the site. The thermal signature of the river crossing does not appear in any Park Service interpretive materials. Rangers are not trained to discuss it, and visitor guides make no mention of temperature variations along the river. Marcus Reyes returned to the site independently in 2018, using a personal thermal camera purchased with his own funds. He was stopped by a park ranger before reaching the river and informed that the area was closed for resource protection. When he asked what resource was being protected, the ranger did not answer. Reyes stood at the edge of the closed zone for several minutes, looking toward the bend in the river where he had waded 6 years earlier. The water looked the same as it had then: shallow, clear, unremarkable. But he remembered the cold, the sudden, sharp cold that had gripped his legs and refused to let go. The feeling that he was not alone in the water, even though he could see the empty riverbed beneath his feet. "I've thought about it a lot since then," he said in a 2020 interview. "Cold water doesn't just appear in the middle of a warm river. It has to come from somewhere. But this didn't come from anywhere. It was just there, like the river was holding on to something, like it didn't want to let it go." The Little Bighorn continues to flow north toward the Bighorn, as it has for thousands of years. The water passes over smooth stones, through cottonwood shade, beneath the open Montana sky. It carries snowmelt in spring and runs low in August. It freezes in January and thaws in March. And somewhere along its course, in a 50-foot stretch that appears identical to every other stretch, the water runs cold. 8 degrees colder than it should be. Cold enough to notice. Cold enough to remember. The Cheyenne say soldiers went into that water on a June afternoon in 1876. They say the soldiers never came out. The river, perhaps, is still holding them. The river, perhaps, has not yet let them go. Some things move when no one is watching. Some things have been moving for longer than anyone realized. The artifact storage facility at Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument occupies the basement level of the administrative building, a nondescript structure located approximately 200 yards northeast of the visitor center. The facility was constructed in 1963 as part of a broader effort to consolidate and preserve materials recovered from the battlefield over the preceding decades: shell casings, uniform buttons, bone fragments, and miscellaneous objects collected during various archaeological surveys and maintenance operations. Among the items transferred to the new facility was a small cairn of stones, catalogued as artifact number LBH 1879047. The cairn consisted of 11 irregularly shaped stones, ranging in size from a golf ball to a man's fist, stacked in a rough pyramid, approximately 14 inches tall. According to documentation from the War Department, the stones had been gathered in August of 1879 by a burial detail tasked with reinterring remains that had become exposed by erosion on the eastern slope of Last Stand Hill. The detail's commanding officer, a Lieutenant Edward Prescott, ordered the stones collected after noticing that they had been deliberately arranged around a shallow depression in the soil, a formation he believed might mark an undocumented burial site. Excavation of the depression yielded no remains, but Prescott noted in his report that the stones appeared to have been placed with intention, not scattered by natural action. He recommended they be preserved for further study. The stones were transported to Fort Custer, then to a War Department warehouse in St. Louis, and finally to the Smithsonian Institution, where they remained in storage until their transfer to Little Bighorn in 1963. For over 80 years, they attracted no particular attention. They were simply stones, unremarkable specimens of the same sandstone and granite that littered the battlefield by the thousands. In 1965, the monument's first professional archivist, a woman named Constance Bergstrom, implemented a systematic documentation protocol for all stored artifacts. Each item was to be photographed monthly in its exact storage position, creating a visual record that could be used to detect deterioration, unauthorized handling, or environmental damage over time. The protocol was thorough but unglamorous, the kind of bureaucratic procedure that generates binders of nearly identical photographs, useful primarily for insurance purposes and rarely examined by anyone. Bergstrom photographed artifact LBH 1879047 on the 15th of every month from March 1965 until her retirement in 1982. Her successors continued the practice without interruption. By 2018, the archive contained 637 photographs of the stone cairn, spanning 53 years. It was in that year that a newly hired archivist named Devin Okafor undertook a digitization project, scanning the monument's photographic records for long-term preservation. Okafor was methodical and detail-oriented, qualities that had earned him the position despite limited prior experience with military history. He approached the work systematically, scanning each photograph at high resolution and organizing files by artifact number and date. When he reached the LBH 1879047 folder, he noticed something unusual. The stones in the photographs were not in the same positions. The differences were subtle, so subtle that casual observation would never detect them. But when Okafor enlarged the images and compared them side by side, the variations became unmistakable. A triangular stone that appeared on the left side of the cairn in the 1965 photograph had migrated toward the center by 1972. A rounded gray stone near the base had risen gradually toward the top over the course of 3 decades. The overall shape of the cairn remained consistent, but its internal composition had shifted, stone by stone, photograph by photograph. Okafor initially assumed the cairn had been disturbed during routine access. Perhaps a researcher had examined it and replaced the stones carelessly. But the storage facility logs, which he checked meticulously, showed no recorded entries to the room housing LBH 1879047 between photographic sessions. The room was sealed with a combination lock, and access required written authorization from the superintendent's office. According to the logs, no such authorization had been granted since 1989, when a Smithsonian conservator conducted a condition assessment of selected artifacts. The stones had been alone in that room for 29 years, and yet they had moved. Okafor shared his findings with his supervisor, a senior curator named Dr. Maureen Lightfoot. Lightfoot examined the photographs and confirmed the discrepancies, but struggled to explain them. She suggested that vibrations from nearby construction or traffic might have gradually shifted the stones. But the storage room was located in a basement with no adjacent roadways, and no significant construction had occurred near the administrative building during the relevant period. "I've worked in museum storage for 30 years, Lightfoot said in a later interview. "I've seen objects degrade. I've seen them change color. I've never seen them rearrange themselves." At Okafor's suggestion, the archive photographs were compiled into a time-lapse animation, with each monthly image displayed for 1/10 of a second. The result was deeply unsettling. The stones appeared to rotate, not quickly, not in any way that suggested sudden movement, but slowly, deliberately, in a clockwise pattern that completed approximately 1/4 of a full circle over the 53-year span of documentation. The individual stones did not roll or tumble. They simply occupied different positions in each frame, as if lifted and replaced by invisible hands. Okafor shared the animation with 3 colleagues. All 3 confirmed seeing the rotational pattern. None could offer an explanation. Dr. Lightfoot contacted the Park Service Regional Office in Billings in September of 2018, requesting guidance on how to proceed. Her inquiry was acknowledged but never formally answered. A follow-up call in October was transferred to a voicemail that was never returned. In November, Lightfoot received an email from a deputy superintendent she had never met, informing her that the digitization project had been suspended pending administrative review, and that all materials related to artifact LBH 1879047 should be transferred to the regional office for secure archiving. The email provided no explanation for the suspension and no timeline for resolution. Lightfoot complied with the request. The photographs, the animation file, and Okafor's analysis were boxed and shipped to Billings. She retained no copies. Okafor resigned from his position in January of 2019, citing unrelated career opportunities. In a private conversation with a former colleague, he admitted that the experience had affected him more than he expected. "I kept thinking about those stones sitting in that room," he said, "alone in the dark, month after month, year after year. And the whole time, they were moving. They were doing something. And we only noticed because someone finally looked closely enough." He paused. "What else is moving that we haven't noticed yet?" The storage room containing artifact LBH 1879047 remained sealed. The monthly photographic protocol was discontinued in 2018, replaced by a biannual visual inspection that does not involve photography. The original cairn remains in its position on a steel shelf in the basement of the administrative building. 11 stones arranged in a shape that may or may not be the same shape it held yesterday, or last week, or 50 years ago. Lieutenant Edward Prescott, who ordered the stones collected in 1879, noted in his original report that they had been arranged around a shallow depression he believed might mark a grave. No body was found. But Prescott also noted something else, a detail overlooked in subsequent documentation. The stones, when he first observed them, appeared to be arranged in a circle, not a pyramid, not a cairn, a circle with the depression at its center. The burial detail stacked them into a cairn for transport, believing the original formation to be accidental or the result of weathering. They did not consider that the arrangement might have been intentional. They did not consider that it might have meaning. For 139 years, the stones have been held in storage. For 53 of those years, they were photographed every month. And for all of that time, they have been slowly, imperceptibly, returning to the shape they held when they were first discovered. A circle, rotating clockwise, 1/4 complete. At the current rate of movement, the circle will close in approximately 150 years. What happens when it does, no one can say. No one has asked. Perhaps the stones know. Perhaps they have always known. And in the sealed darkness of a basement storage room, beneath a building that overlooks the battlefield where they were found, the stones continue their work, patient, silent, turning. The dead do not always stay where they are buried, and sometimes there are more dead than anyone remembered to count. Little Bighorn battlefield has been excavated, surveyed, and documented more thoroughly than almost any comparable site in American history. Beginning in 1877, when the first formal attempts were made to locate and reinter remains exposed by weather and wildlife, the battlefield has been subject to nearly continuous archaeological attention. Metal detectors have swept the ridgelines. Soil samples have been analyzed for bone fragments. Aerial photography has mapped every visible marker, trail, and depression across the monument's 765 acres. By the early 1980s, scholars believed they had a reasonably complete picture of where the dead had fallen and where they now rested. The conventional count held that approximately 268 individuals died in the June 1876 engagement. Roughly 215 soldiers and civilians attached to the 7th Cavalry, and approximately 50 to 60 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, though the latter figure remained uncertain due to the tribe's practice of removing their dead from the battlefield. Most of the cavalry dead were buried in shallow graves near where they fell, then reinterred in a mass grave beneath the granite memorial on Last Stand Hill in 1881. Some officers were exhumed and transported to eastern cemeteries at their families' request. The warriors who died were carried away by their people, buried in locations that were never disclosed to the army. The numbers were imprecise, but they were accepted. The battlefield was considered, if not fully accounted for, at least reasonably understood. Then, in 1984, a ground-penetrating radar survey found 247 potential burial sites. The survey was commissioned by the National Park Service as part of a comprehensive archaeological assessment of the monument. The project was led by Dr. Richard Voorhees, a geophysicist from the University of Nebraska, who had previously conducted subsurface surveys at Civil War battlefields in Virginia and Pennsylvania. His team included 3 graduate students, a Park Service archaeologist named Janet Two Bears, and a technical specialist from a private firm that manufactured ground-penetrating radar equipment. Ground-penetrating radar works by transmitting electromagnetic pulses into the soil and measuring the signals that bounce back. Different materials, rock, metal, bone, disturbed earth, reflect the pulses differently, creating a profile of what lies beneath the surface. The technology was relatively new in 1984, but it had already proven effective at locating unmarked graves, buried foundations, and other subsurface features invisible to conventional excavation. The team began their survey on June 2, 1984, working systematically across the battlefield in a grid pattern. Each day, they covered approximately 15 acres, dragging the radar unit across the grass, while a portable computer recorded the subsurface data. The work was tedious and physically demanding, but the early results were encouraging. The radar clearly detected known features, including the mass grave beneath Last Stand Hill and several marked burials in Custer National Cemetery. By the end of the second week, however, the data had become troubling. The radar was detecting far more subsurface anomalies than expected. Some corresponded to documented burial sites. Others did not. The anomalies appeared throughout the battlefield, on ridgelines, in coulées, along the river valley, in areas where no remains had ever been reported. Each anomaly displayed characteristics consistent with disturbed soil containing organic material, the distinctive signature of a grave. Dr. Voorhees initially assumed the equipment was malfunctioning. He recalibrated the radar unit twice and conducted control tests in areas outside the monument boundaries where no burials had occurred. The equipment functioned normally. The anomalies persisted. By the end of the survey, the team had documented 247 potential burial sites across the monument. Voorhees cross-referenced the locations against all known historical records, Army reports, archaeological surveys, reinterment documents, and the monument's own administrative files. Approximately 160 of the anomalies corresponded to documented burials or areas of known disturbance. 87 did not. 87 potential graves in locations where no one had ever reported burying anyone. Janet Two Bears, the Park Service archaeologist assigned to the project, reviewed the data with growing unease. She had worked at Little Bighorn for 6 years and knew the historical record intimately. The documented casualties, soldiers, scouts, and warriors could not account for 87 additional remains, even allowing for generous margins of error. "The numbers don't work," she said in a memorandum to her supervisor dated July 19, 1984. "We have more potential graves than we have documented dead. Either the historical casualty figures are significantly wrong, or the radar is detecting something we don't understand." She proposed a limited excavation to verify the anomalies, a test dig at 3 or 4 locations to determine whether the radar signatures represented actual human remains. Her proposal was forwarded to the regional office in Billings for approval. The response came 3 weeks later. The excavation was denied. The survey data was to be compiled into a final report and submitted to the regional office for review. No public announcement would be made until the report had been evaluated. Voorhees completed his final report in September of 1984. It ran to 112 pages, including detailed maps showing the location of each anomaly, technical specifications for the radar equipment, and a statistical analysis of the findings. The report concluded that the survey had detected a significant number of subsurface features consistent with human burial, and recommended further investigation to determine their nature and origin. The report was stamped administratively sensitive and placed in restricted files at the regional office. It has never been released to the public. Voorhees submitted a Freedom of Information Act request for his own report in 1989. The request was denied on grounds that the document contained information that could lead to disturbance of protected cultural resources. An appeal was rejected in 1991 with no additional explanation. In 1997, a researcher named Gordon Whitehorse, no relation to any Park Service employee, obtained a partial copy of the report through unofficial channels. The copy was incomplete, missing approximately 40 pages, but it confirmed the essential findings: 247 anomalies, 87 unexplained. Whitehorse published an article about the survey in a small circulation journal dedicated to battlefield archaeology. The article generated modest interest among specialists, but received no mainstream attention. The Park Service declined to comment on the findings. Janet Tubears left the Park Service in 1987. In a 2004 interview with an oral history project at Montana State University, she described the 1984 survey as the strangest experience of my career. "We found graves that shouldn't exist," she said, "not one or two dozens. And instead of investigating, we were told to stop asking questions. I never understood why. I still don't." She was asked if she had any theories about the unexplained anomalies. She paused for a long moment before answering. "There are stories among my people," she said. "Stories about what happened here that never made it into the official histories. The Army counted their own dead. They didn't count everyone." She did not elaborate. Dr. Richard Voorhees died in 2011 at the age of 74. His personal papers, donated to the University of Nebraska Archives, include correspondence with colleagues about the Little Bighorn survey. In one letter, dated December of 1984, he wrote, "I have conducted subsurface surveys at 17 historical sites. I have never encountered data I could not explain, until now." The ground-penetrating radar technology has advanced significantly since 1984. Modern equipment is capable of producing high-resolution, three-dimensional images of subsurface features, far surpassing the capabilities of the instruments Voorhees used. A contemporary survey could likely resolve many of the ambiguities in the original data. No such survey has been authorized. The Park Service's current position, articulated in response to a 2016 inquiry from a historical preservation group, is that existing documentation adequately accounts for known burial sites within the monument boundaries, and that additional subsurface investigation is not warranted at this time. The 247 anomalies remain undisturbed. The 87 unexplained sites remain unexplored. Somewhere beneath the grass of Little Bighorn, in coulees, on ridgelines, along the river where the water runs cold, something lies buried that no one has ever claimed. The Army counted 215 of their own. The tribes removed their dead in the night, carrying them to places that would never be marked. But the radar counted 247. The mathematics do not reconcile. The bodies do not match the names. And in the silence of the prairie, beneath soil that has not been turned for a century, the unexplained remain exactly where they have always been, waiting, perhaps, for someone to finally ask who they are, or perhaps hoping that no one ever does. Some shadows are cast by things we can see, and some shadows are cast by things that are no longer there. The Last Stand Monument rises from the crest of the hill where George Armstrong Custer and the remnants of his command made their final defense on June 25, 1876. The granite obelisk, dedicated in 1881, stands approximately 36 feet tall, its base surrounded by an iron fence enclosing the mass grave where the remains of over 200 soldiers were reinterred after their original shallow burials proved inadequate against the Montana elements. The monument is the most photographed feature of Little Bighorn Battlefield. Visitors pose before it year-round, capturing images that appear in family albums, history textbooks, and tourism brochures. On June 25th, the anniversary of the battle, the crowds are particularly dense. Historians, reenactors, descendants of soldiers, and warriors alike gather to commemorate an event that continues to resonate nearly 150 years after it occurred. It was during one such anniversary gathering, in 1931, that a newspaper photographer from Billings, named Oscar Henriksen, captured something he could not explain. Henriksen had been assigned to photograph the 50th anniversary commemoration, a modest ceremony attended by approximately 200 visitors, including 3 elderly Crow Scouts who had served with the Army during the original campaign. He positioned himself southwest of the monument, shooting toward the northeast to capture both the obelisk and the assembled crowd against the afternoon sky. At approximately 3:45 in the afternoon, Henriksen noticed something unusual through his viewfinder. A shadow had fallen across the base of the monument, a dark, elongated shape that stretched from the northwest corner of the iron fence toward the center of the memorial. The shadow was sharply defined, its edges crisp against the sunlit granite. Henriksen assumed a cloud had passed overhead, but when he lowered his camera and looked up, the sky was clear. No clouds, no aircraft, nothing that could account for the shadow on the ground. He took 3 photographs in rapid succession. By the time he advanced the film for a 4th exposure, the shadow had vanished. The photographs were developed at the Billings Gazette's in-house laboratory the following day. 2 of the 3 images clearly showed the anomalous shadow. Henriksen showed them to his editor, who dismissed them as a processing defect, a light leak, perhaps, or contamination in the chemical bath. The images were filed without publication. Henriksen kept copies. He returned to the battlefield on June 25, 1932, and again on June 25, 1933. Both years, he observed the same phenomenon at approximately the same time, a shadow falling across the monument with no visible source, lasting roughly 90 seconds before fading. He photographed it each time. He showed the images to colleagues, friends, and family. None could explain what they saw. None could deny that the shadow appeared in the photographs, sharp and distinct, falling in a direction inconsistent with the sun's position. Henriksen died in 1958. His photographs, along with his handwritten notes on the phenomenon, were donated to the Montana Historical Society by his widow. They remained in archival storage, uncatalogued, until 1987, when a graduate student named Teresa Maciejewski discovered them while researching Depression-era photojournalism. Maciejewski was intrigued by Henriksen's meticulous documentation. He had recorded the date, time, weather conditions, and sun angle for each photograph. He had sketched the shadow's approximate shape and position relative to the monument. He had even calculated the theoretical direction a shadow should fall based on the sun's azimuth at 3:45 on June 25th, and noted that the anomalous shadow fell in a direction 47 degrees off, the expected bearing. The shadow, according to Henriksen's analysis, appeared to originate from a point approximately 15 feet north-northwest of the monument, a location where nothing stood in 1881, where nothing stands today. Maciejewski published a brief article about Henriksen's photographs in a regional historical journal in 1989. The article generated modest interest and prompted several amateur photographers to visit the battlefield on subsequent anniversaries. Over the following decades, additional photographs of the shadow accumulated in private collections and online archives. A retired aerospace engineer named Douglas Akiyama compiled what he described as the most comprehensive database of shadow photographs in 2008. His collection included 43 images taken between 1931 and 2007, submitted by photographers ranging from professional journalists to casual tourists. The photographs varied in quality and composition, but all shared common characteristics. The shadow appeared between 3:40 and 3:50 in the afternoon on June 25th. It lasted between 75 and 100 seconds. It fell across the northwest quadrant of the monument's base, extending toward the center of the memorial. Its shape was consistent across photographs, elongated, roughly humanoid in proportion, with what some observers described as a rounded protrusion at the upper end, suggestive of a head and shoulders. Akiyama submitted his findings to 3 academic journals between 2009 and 2012. All 3 rejected his papers. Reviewer comments described the phenomenon as insufficiently documented, likely attributable to atmospheric effects, and outside the scope of rigorous scientific inquiry. A physicist at the University of Montana, Dr. Elaine Nachtrieb, reviewed Akiyama's data informally in 2011. She calculated the solar geometry for each documented observation and confirmed that the anomalous shadow fell in a direction incompatible with direct sunlight. She proposed several possible explanations: atmospheric refraction caused by temperature gradients, reflection from distant geological formations, or an unusual interaction between the monument's granite surface and ambient light. None of her hypotheses accounted for the shadow's consistency across decades, its precise annual timing, or its apparent origination from empty space. "I can tell you what the shadow is not," Nachtrieb said in an email to Akiyama. "I cannot tell you what it is." The National Park Service has never officially acknowledged the phenomenon. Interpretive materials at the battlefield make no mention of the anniversary shadow. Rangers are not trained to discuss it, and visitor inquiries are typically redirected to general information about the monument's history and construction. A seasonal ranger who worked at Little Bighorn from 2014 to 2018, speaking on condition of anonymity, confirmed that staff were aware of the shadow but had been instructed not to speculate about it publicly. Every year on the anniversary, you'd see photographers positioning themselves around the monument, starting around 3 o'clock, the ranger said. Regulars who came back year after year. They knew exactly when it would happen and exactly where to stand. Nobody talked about it officially, but everybody knew. The ranger was asked if they had personally witnessed the phenomenon. "Once," they said. "In 2016, I was standing near the fence when it happened. The shadow just appeared, not gradually, like a cloud moving, but all at once, like something had stepped between me and the sun. Except there was nothing there, just empty air." The ranger paused. It lasted maybe a minute and a half, and then it was gone. And the sun was exactly where it had been the whole time. Nothing had moved. Nothing had changed. Except for those 90 seconds, something was there that wasn't supposed to be. Historians have debated the precise moment of Custer's death for over a century. Eyewitness accounts from surviving soldiers and native warriors offer conflicting timelines, and no definitive record exists. The most widely accepted estimate, based on the sun's position as described in contemporary accounts and the progression of the fighting, places his death between 3:30 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon. 3:45 falls precisely in the center of that window. The shadow falls precisely at 3:45. It falls from a point where nothing stands, a point 15 feet north-northwest of the monument, within the iron fence, within the boundaries of the mass grave, where the unidentified remains of over 200 soldiers were placed in 1881. Some of those remains have never been individually identified. Some of those men have never been officially accounted for. The monument bears no names, only the collective memory of those who died on this hill, on this day, at this hour. Perhaps the shadow is an atmospheric anomaly. Perhaps it is a trick of light and granite and the particular geometry of a Montana afternoon. Perhaps it means nothing at all. But every year, on June 25th, at 3:45 in the afternoon, something casts a shadow across the Last Stand monument. Something that stands where nothing should stand. something that appears for 90 seconds and then is gone. The photographers return each year. They set up their cameras, they wait, and the shadow falls, as it has fallen for almost a century, marking a moment that history has never quite been able to pin down, the moment when everything ended, the moment when something, perhaps, began. The airwaves carry more than we intend them to, and sometimes they carry things that were never meant to be heard again. The centennial commemoration of the Battle of Little Bighorn took place on June 25th and 26th, 1976. It was the largest gathering the battlefield had ever hosted, over 15,000 visitors across 2 days, including historians, military officials, tribal delegations, and descendants of both the soldiers and warriors who had fought on this ground a century earlier. The National Park Service had spent months preparing for the event, coordinating with federal, state, and tribal agencies to ensure that the commemoration honored all perspectives on the battle's complex legacy. The weather cooperated, the crowds were respectful, the speeches were solemn and measured. By all official accounts, the centennial was a success, a dignified tribute to a moment in American history that continued to resonate across generations. But among those 15,000 visitors, at least 17 would later report experiencing something that no official account ever mentioned. The first report came from a retired postal worker named Franklin Delacroix, who had driven from Fargo, North Dakota, with his wife to attend the commemoration. Delacroix carried a portable AM/FM radio, a Panasonic RF-1401, according to his later testimony, which he used to follow news broadcasts during long drives. On the afternoon of June 25th, while standing near the Reno-Benteen defense site, he turned on the radio to check the weather forecast. The radio picked up static on the AM band, as expected in the rural Montana terrain. Delacroix scanned through the frequencies, searching for a clear signal. At approximately 580 kilohertz, a frequency with no registered broadcaster in the region, the static cleared. A voice emerged. Male, calm, speaking in a measured cadence that Delacroix later described as mechanical, like someone reading from a script. The voice was reciting numbers. 41 degrees, 52 minutes north, 107 degrees, 25 minutes west. Casualties reported. Company C, 17. Company I, 22. Company L, 14. Awaiting confirmation on Company E. Repeat transmission at 0600. Delacroix listened for approximately 30 seconds before the transmission dissolved back into static. He adjusted the dial, attempting to find the signal again, but the frequency returned only white noise. He mentioned the experience to his wife, who had not been listening to the radio. She suggested he had picked up a stray military broadcast, perhaps from a training exercise at a nearby base. Delacroix accepted this explanation and thought little more of it. 3 days later, while reading a newspaper article about the commemoration, he noticed a letter to the editor from a woman in Billings who described hearing the same transmission on her portable radio at approximately the same time. Her description matched his exactly: the coordinates, the company designations, the casualty numbers, the instruction to repeat at 0600. Delacroix wrote to the newspaper, which published his letter the following week. Over the next 2 months, 15 additional individuals contacted either the newspaper or the Park Service to report similar experiences. All had been present at the battlefield on June 25, 1976. All had been listening to portable radios tuned to AM frequencies. All reported hearing the same male voice, reciting the same information on the same unused frequency. The Federal Communications Commission Regional Office in Billings received 3 formal complaints about the transmission in August of 1976. The complainants were concerned that an unlicensed broadcaster was operating in the area, potentially interfering with emergency communications. The FCC opened a routine investigation. The investigation concluded in October of that year. According to the final report, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request in 1992, no licensed or unlicensed broadcaster was operating on 580 kilohertz in southeastern Montana. On June 25, 1976, the frequency was unassigned and had been dormant for decades. The report noted that the described transmission coordinates, casualty figures, and a scheduled repeat was consistent with military communication protocols from the late 19th century, when the Army used telegraph to voice transcription systems to relay battlefield reports. Such systems had been obsolete since approximately 1905 and had never been adapted for radio broadcast. The FCC investigator, a field engineer named Bernard Ostrowski, added a handwritten note to the file. Transmission style inconsistent with any known modern technology. Unable to identify source. Recommend closure without resolution. The case was closed. No further investigation was conducted. Dr. Helena Vasquez, a communications historian at the University of New Mexico, examined the FCC report in 2003 as part of her research on anomalous radio phenomena. She was particularly struck by Ostrowski's description of the transmission style. Telegraph-to-voice systems were used extensively by the military between 1875 and 1900, Vasquez explained in a 2006 lecture. An operator would receive a telegraphed message and read it aloud for recording or relay. The cadence was distinctive, flat, rhythmic, with specific pauses for punctuation and code groups. It sounds nothing like modern radio broadcasting. Vasquez obtained testimony from 4 surviving witnesses who had heard the 1976 transmission. All described the voice in similar terms: calm, uninflected, with an almost hypnotic regularity. One witness, a high school history teacher named Roberta Gunderson, said the voice sounded like someone reading from a telegram, not talking to anyone in particular. Vasquez attempted to verify the coordinates mentioned in the transmission: 41 degrees, 52 minutes north latitude, and 107 degrees, 25 minutes west longitude, placed the location approximately 40 miles southeast of the battlefield, in an area of open rangeland with no documented historical significance. But when Vasquez cross-referenced the coordinates with 19th century survey maps, she discovered something unexpected. The location corresponded to a telegraph relay station that had operated briefly in 1876 and 1877, serving as a link between Fort Custer and the broader military communication network. The station had been abandoned in 1878. No trace of it remained on the modern landscape. Vasquez published her findings in a 2007 article for an academic journal specializing in communication technology history. The article generated modest interest among specialists but received no mainstream attention. Several readers wrote to question whether the witnesses might have misremembered the experience, conflating details from multiple sources over the intervening decades. Vasquez acknowledged this possibility, but noted that the witnesses had described the transmission independently, without knowledge of each other's accounts, within weeks of the original event. Their descriptions remained consistent across 30 years of subsequent interviews. Collective confabulation is possible, she wrote in a follow-up correspondence. But 17 people independently fabricating the same specific details, coordinates, company designations, casualty numbers, a transmission schedule, strains credulity. The casualty numbers mentioned in the transmission, 17 for Company C, 22 for Company I, 14 for Company L, do not precisely match official records from the Battle of Little Bighorn. Historical documentation indicates that Company C lost approximately 38 men, Company I lost approximately 43, and Company L lost approximately 44. But Vasquez discovered that the transmitted numbers matched preliminary casualty estimates recorded in a telegraph dispatch sent from Fort Abraham Lincoln on June 28, 1876, 3 days after the battle, before accurate counts were available. The dispatch was one of the first official communications about the battle's outcome. It contained incomplete and inaccurate information based on fragmentary reports from scouts and survivors. The numbers were corrected in subsequent dispatches as more complete information became available. The transmission heard in 1976, if the witnesses are to be believed, was repeating information that had been obsolete for a century, information that existed only in archived military records that none of the witnesses had ever seen. The 17 witnesses have been interviewed periodically by researchers and journalists over the years. Their accounts have remained consistent. Several have died. The youngest, who was 14 in 1976, is now in his early 60s. None have ever heard the transmission again. None have offered an explanation for what they heard. None have claimed to understand what it meant. Franklin Delacroix died in 2009 at the age of 83. In his final interview, conducted by a local historian in 2007, he was asked what he believed he had heard that day at Little Bighorn. He was quiet for a long moment. "I think I heard someone doing their job," he said. "Someone who didn't know the war was over. Someone still sending reports, still counting the dead, still waiting for someone to answer." He paused. Maybe they're still waiting. Maybe they'll always be waiting. And maybe, on the right frequency, on the right day, you can still hear them calling out to a world that stopped listening 100 years ago. The frequency remains unassigned. 580 kilohertz carries nothing but static in southeastern Montana. But every June 25th, a handful of visitors to Little Bighorn bring portable radios. They scan the dial. They listen. Most hear nothing. The airwaves are silent. But some pause at 580. Some adjust the antenna. Some hold their breath and wait. And some, perhaps, hear a voice calm, measured, reading numbers that no longer matter, coordinates that no longer exist, casualties that have long since been counted, and buried, and forgotten. A voice, still waiting for confirmation. A voice that never received a reply. Words have a way of finding their way to the page. Sometimes, they find their way long after the hand that wrote them has turned to dust. The bench near Calhoun Hill has overlooked the southeastern slope of Little Bighorn battlefield since 1947, when the Civilian Conservation Corps installed a series of rest areas along the monument's interpretive trail. The bench is made of weathered pine, its slats worn smooth by decades of visitors pausing to take in the view. From this vantage point, one can see the cluster of marble headstones marking where Lieutenant James Calhoun and the men of Company L fell on June 25, 1876, as well as the rolling prairie descending toward the river valley below. It is a quiet spot. Removed from the main trail by approximately 50 yards, it attracts fewer visitors than the more prominent overlooks near Last Stand Hill. Those who do rest here often comment on the stillness, the absence of wind, the muted quality of sound, the sense that time moves differently in this particular corner of the battlefield. It was on this bench, on the afternoon of August 7, 1958, that a woman named Miriam Castellano experienced something she would spend the rest of her life trying to understand. Castellano was 43 years old, a bookkeeper from Scranton, Pennsylvania, traveling alone on a cross-country trip following her divorce the previous year. She had no particular interest in military history and had stopped at Little Bighorn primarily because it appeared on her roadmap as a point of interest between Billings and her ultimate destination of Yellowstone National Park. She arrived at the battlefield shortly after noon, purchased a guidebook from the visitor center, and spent the next 2 hours walking the interpretive trail. Like many visitors, she carried a personal journal, a cloth-bound notebook in which she recorded observations, expenses, and occasional reflections on her journey. At approximately 2:45 in the afternoon, Castellano reached the bench near Calhoun Hill. She sat down to rest, placed her journal open on the bench beside her, and removed her camera, a Kodak Brownie Star Flash, to photograph the marble markers on the slope below. The process required her to walk approximately 30 feet from the bench to find an unobstructed angle. She was gone for no more than 3 minutes. When she returned, she noticed that a page in her journal had been turned. The notebook had been opened to a blank page. Now it displayed her most recent entry from that morning, along with something new beneath it. A single sentence, written in neat, slightly slanted script. "Tell Mother the horses suffered most Castellano's first reaction was confusion. She looked around, expecting to see another visitor, perhaps a child playing a prank, or a well-meaning stranger who had mistaken her journal for a guest book. The bench was empty. The nearest people were a couple photographing the memorial, approximately 200 yards to the north. She examined the handwriting. It was not her own. Her script was rounded and compact, with distinctive loops on her lowercase letters. This writing was angular, precise, with a formality that suggested 19th century penmanship training. The ink appeared fresh, slightly darker than the entries she had written earlier, but when she touched it, it did not smudge. Castellano tore the page from the journal. She placed it in her wallet and continued her tour of the battlefield in a state of increasing unease. By the time she reached the visitor center, she had decided to report the incident to a ranger. The ranger on duty, a young man named Thomas Prideaux, listened to her account with polite skepticism. He examined the torn page and noted the unusual handwriting, but could offer no explanation. He suggested that someone might have approached the bench while she was photographing and written the message as a joke. Castellano pointed out that she had been gone for only 3 minutes and had maintained a clear sightline to the bench for most of that time. She had seen no one approach. Prideaux documented the incident in his daily log, a brief entry noting, "Visitor report of unexplained writing," but took no further action. He returned the page to Castellano, who folded it carefully and placed it back in her wallet. She kept it there for the next 46 years. Miriam Castellano died in 2004 at the age of 89. Her nephew, a retired attorney named Victor Castellano, inherited her personal effects, including the wallet containing the folded journal page. Victor had heard his aunt tell the story of the Calhoun Hill incident many times throughout his childhood, always with the same details, always with the same quiet bewilderment. He decided to investigate. Victor contacted a forensic document examiner named Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, who specialized in handwriting analysis for estate disputes and historical authentication. He provided her with the journal page and asked whether she could determine anything about the unknown writer. Dr. Okonkwo's analysis, completed in September of 2004, confirmed that the handwriting was inconsistent with Miriam Castellano's known script. The writing displayed characteristics of 19th century American penmanship, specifically the Spencerian style taught in schools between approximately 1850 and 1920. The pen pressure, letter spacing, and stroke patterns suggested a writer who had received formal instruction in this method. The analysis also identified several distinctive features: a particular flourish on the capital letter T, an unusual formation of the lowercase h, and a slight leftward slant, inconsistent with typical right-handed writing. Victor Castellano, on a hunch, contacted the United States Military Academy at West Point, which maintains archives of correspondence from officers and enlisted men who served in the Frontier Army. He asked whether any letters from soldiers who died at Little Bighorn might be available for comparison. The archivist who responded, a civilian historian named Margaret Holloway, was initially reluctant to assist with what she described as an unconventional request, but she agreed to examine the page if Victor could provide a high-resolution scan. 3 weeks later, Holloway called Victor with unexpected news. The handwriting on the journal page matched samples from a collection of letters written by Sergeant James Butler of Company L, 7th Cavalry. Butler had enlisted in 1873 and served at various posts in the Dakota Territory before his death at Little Bighorn on June 25, 1876. His letters home, primarily to his mother in Albany, New York, were donated to West Point by his descendants in 1932. Holloway had compared the journal page to 4 separate letters in Butler's file. The match was not absolute. Handwriting analysis is not an exact science, but she rated the probability of common authorship as highly likely. The phrase, "the horses suffered most," appeared nowhere in Butler's surviving correspondence. But his letters repeatedly mentioned his concern for the cavalry mounts, which endured harsh conditions during the frontier campaigns. In one letter dated March of 1876, he wrote, "The animals bear the worst of it. We can rest in camp. They cannot rest from carrying us." Butler was 31 years old when he died. He had never married. His mother, Sarah Butler, outlived him by 23 years, passing away in Albany in 1899. She never received a message from her son about the horses. Victor Castellano published his findings in a 2006 article for a regional historical journal. The article included Dr. Okonkwo's handwriting analysis, Holloway's comparison to the West Point letters, and a detailed account of his aunt's original experience. The response was mixed. Some readers found the evidence compelling. Others dismissed it as coincidence or misidentification. Several handwriting experts who reviewed the analysis disagreed with the highly likely assessment, suggesting that the similarities could be attributed to the general characteristics of Spencerian penmanship rather than a specific individual. The National Park Service declined to comment on the article. A spokesperson noted only that the service does not investigate claims of paranormal activity. Miriam Castellano, in her later years, rarely spoke about the incident unprompted, but when asked, she always described it the same way. "I set down my journal for 3 minutes," she would say. 3 minutes. "And when I came back, someone had written a message to their mother. A message she never received. A message that had been waiting over 80 years to be written." She would pause, as if considering whether to continue. "I don't know who James Butler was. I never heard his name until Victor found those letters. But I know what he wanted. He wanted his mother to know about the horses. He wanted someone to tell her." She would look at her hands, the hands that had not written the words. "I don't know why he chose me. I don't know why he chose that day. But I carried his message for 46 years, and now the world knows what he wanted to say." The journal page remains in Victor Castellano's possession. He has declined offers to donate it to museums or historical societies, preferring to keep it within the family. Sergeant James Butler is buried somewhere beneath the mass grave on Last Stand Hill. His name does not appear on any individual marker. His letters rest in an archive at West Point, read only by occasional researchers interested in the daily lives of frontier soldiers. But his final message, if it was his message, exists on a torn page from a tourist's journal, written in handwriting that matches his own, saying what he never had the chance to say. "Tell mother the horses suffered most." Sarah Butler died in 1899 without receiving her son's last words. But perhaps, in some way that logic cannot explain, the message was finally sent. Perhaps the words found their way to the page because they had waited long enough. And perhaps, somewhere beyond the silence of the battlefield, a son finally told his mother what he needed her to know.